Thinking Basketball Podcast. My name is Ben. Welcome back to the maybe 8th annual Best Players of the Year conversation. I've lost track at this point, honestly. But this has become my least favorite podcast to do. And I wasn't sure I wanted to do it this year because the business, Cody, of making lists of basketball players and ranking basketball players just becomes less and less enjoyable over the years. Everybody wants to tell you how wrong you are and how, you're right when you agree with them. But then when you find a spot where you disagree, then you're wrong objectively and you're a moron objectively. Everyone knows you should be put aside with a dunce cap at that point. But also, it's become harder and harder, as we've talked about over the years in breaking down players, to really try to wrangle their value and what that means in a single context. And the more we do this, the more I think about player value in different settings with different coaches, with different teammates. And I think that's how a lot of teams and front offices think about this. If you're a coach, you think about, how can I amplify a player? How can I put him in the best position to succeed with the players I have? That's pretty much the only perspective you get to have. If you work in a front office, you're thinking, how can we fit this player into our team, or how can we configure our team around certain players? And that's where I think talking about the different contexts and building around players and their fit and how they scale and how their skills travel and how they interact is so valuable. And then, of course, at the end of the day, we have to boil that down to a single range or something like that. Cody, you love this podcast. This is something that you're excited about and you're jazzed about. And we'll get into it in a second. But how are you feeling? This is, we've done this so many times that we're going to do it again in 2026, where I think the world is under our feet is shifting a little bit. I think it's not easy to figure out where these players are. And yes, we can say like, okay, there's no way Nikola Jokic is the 28th best player in the league. Like, we're pretty certain about that. We can say he's probably not the 14th best player in the league, but what are the actual ranges? Who are the candidates for number 1? Who are the candidates for top 5? Who are the candidates for top 10? That is still something that's very hard to figure out. And to me, maybe secondary to talking about all the other situations these players could land in.
I think what I like about it the most is the actual mental exercise of it. Nothing makes me feel like I appreciate the current season and even the current landscape of players more than getting a giant spreadsheet together, taking, say, like the first 30 guys that I think are going to be eligible, and then just tinkering, like taking out the little mallet and being like, all right, so if this person's here and this person's here, then that necessarily means this person's here. And then you start looking at offense and you start just like diving into things and you find all these little like levers that you need to pull. It's like, how is it, like, maybe this person's better both on offense and defense than this person, but somehow I still think they're better. So there's like some kind of abstract nature of basketball, that the alchemy of it, the mysticism, Ben, that I don't quite understand. And then I have to try and figure out why I believe what I believe. So I just think that exercise and have, listen, Ben, anytime I get to have a rigorous conversation like this with you, I walk away learning a lot. And so when I have to sit alone and do this, because here's the thing, every year, Ben and I do not share lists. I have no idea what Ben is cooking up over there. I have no idea what direction we're going to be going. But by the end of it, my notes are conversation, reflecting on it afterwards. I just feel like I have the best grasp of the season that I have than at any point. And then I have a nice little document that I have everything typed up. So, next season when we start doing this again, I can just go back and be like, oh, this is how I thought about this person. This is how I thought about this person. So it's just kind of like the groundwork that continually like builds up. I think that's what I like most about it.
When you said you busted out a spreadsheet, I thought, man, you are a rankings purist. And then that got me thinking, is a rankings purist someone who really likes to, in their mind, like, this is the neat number 1. This is my favorite album of all time. This is my second favorite album of all time. This is my third favorite album of all time. And then I was thinking, like, is that rankings monogamy? Are you really just married to that one thing? And have I become a rankings polygamist over the years? And that's what's happened. It's like, the answer for me is it depends on the perspective. Yeah. And I think at the end, we'll try to say that means this player or these players have the best argument for number 1 or top 5 or whatever. But I just want to be clear that, the meat, Cody, is in this discussion and bouncing these ideas around. And I'm excited for what you have to say, but it's also just every year that goes by and the league becomes smarter and more complicated and more complex and faster and more uncertain, and the margins get smaller and all that. I just look at these players and I'm like, yeah, I don't know what to do with Cade Cunningham. I don't know what Cade Cunningham is. I don't know. I really don't know. So there's a lot of players that we want to discuss. And I think in honor of, I have an alphabetical list in front of me of just players to discuss. But before we start going through that list of players to discuss, just in honor of Giannis Antetokounmpo finally being traded after 6 long years of suffering trade rumors, as you've let us see here, his beautiful Finals MVP jersey from 2021 there, if you're watching on YouTube. He's finally traded to the Miami Heat, and I thought I was going to be excited to talk about Giannis anyway, and thought about leading with Giannis anyway when I was blocking this out last week, because he feels like a forgotten superstar in the league a little bit. Circumstance, injury, age, all these things happen. If you don't run deep in the playoffs, you get pushed out of the limelight of the culture. So maybe in honor of that, we can start with Giannis. One more thing to flag before we jump in and start talking about these players. Of course, we are talking about on-court impact. We're talking about things that we think we can see that are tangible and measurable, both in the film and in a player's style and in data points that come out. But we care about the playoffs. We care about that environment. We care about trying to win at that environment. And finally, about half of these players were in our series last summer on the best 21st century peaks. So including Giannis, there will be some references for those players that are quicker back to those series on much deeper topics about what makes those players either very successful or have shortcomings. I mean, that's probably my favorite part of this whole thing, Cody, is just nitpicking like the greatest players in the world and being like, yeah, it's true. In that area, you're not quite as good as this other guy. And that is a quote unquote weakness, even if that weakness is in the 94th percentile in the league in that category or something. So without further ado, would you like to kick us off with probably the Milwaukee Bucks' greatest player in franchise history, Giannis Antetokounmpo?
I would probably definitively say that Giannis is the greatest Buck in NBA history. And you can do like a peaks thing and say like, Kareem during the first championship run could be better, but it doesn't matter. The body of work to me is unbelievable, which blows my mind, because when he first came into the league, and I'm going to backtrack a little bit, I'm going to wax poetic for just a moment, if you'll allow me on this very long podcast. But I remember, having debates in my dorm room between Jabari Parker and Andrew Wiggins at that point. And it's like, oh, who are the Bucks going to want? And when that core started building up in my head, I'm like, all right, Jabari Parker is going to be like a Paul Pierce. Giannis is going to be like maybe a hypercharged Scottie Pippen, and Greg Monroe is going to be a really solid big man down there. And then things didn't quite develop in that way, but somehow they went almost in a better direction. And you saw flashes of it. Like in 2017, he has this dunk against the Knicks, picks off a pass from Carmelo Anthony, and he dunks like one step inside of the elbow from the free throw line. And you're like, this guy's physical tools are just off the charts, right? And then they make it to the playoffs. They take the Raptors to 6 games as the 6th seed. And that's also when you see Thon McCurr there. And those two together, I'm like, the length between these guys, their defensive impact is just off the charts. Like whatever's going to happen, it's going to be better than anything we could have thought of. 2018 rolls around. They push the Celtics to 7 games behind Chris Middleton shooting like 70% true shooting, right? But then 2019, and I'm not going to really go anywhere beyond that, but I just wanted to say where we started was just this guy with unbelievable athletic tools that I saw the defensive potential, but just actualized offensively in a way that I don't think anyone could have seen except somebody like Coach Budenholzer. That's just like spread ball, just like I was doing at the Atlanta Hawks. We get Brook Lopez to play the 5. We get rid of Eric Bledsoe, who I also love as a defensive guy, get Drew Holiday in here. And this should be a title favorite every year. Injuries got in the way and whatever else got in the way. But here we are, Ben, in 2026. Giannis plays like less than 40 games. He plays less than 30 minutes per game just because he spends most of the season ramping up. But I got to say, Ben, when Giannis was healthy this season, he looked really good. I think you could make an argument that this, at his best, was the best or one of the best offensive seasons that Giannis put together. Like there was a patience to it, his passing, some of the like mid-range type shooting, the post moves. And so that's kind of where I want to start. Is you're right. I don't know what to do about some of the injury and ramping up stuff, but I think the evidence at his peak during the season is still of a guy who's pretty unbelievable at the game of basketball.
Wow. Cody, you know, we're going to probably do another podcast on the trade, Cody. I mean, it's just, I was wondering how many years of Milwaukee Bucks history we were going to go through there. You went into a dream state. That was incredible. I think I would like to start by just laying out the strengths and weaknesses of each of these players as we go through them, and then we can discuss. So in this case, with Giannis, it's things we talked about last summer in our peak series where his pressure on the basket in a playoff series is still a thing that you have to account for. Something we just saw in a similar way with Victor Wembanyama. Like, you're throwing multiple bodies at all times, maybe not quite as much off ball or in a roll situation, but when Giannis has that space that the Bucks tried to create for him, either in early offense, in transition, especially top of the key mismatches, he's very quick and he's very difficult to handle. And he still has that. And to your point, what he still has now is the mid-range jumper-ish little counter that he's added over the years, and some of the passing that he's improved over the years. Some of the reads way back in the 2021 finals that he started to make, countering the wall, countering gap defenders sitting in his space, were a big deal that we've talked about before. So he has all of these things still at a very high level in 2026. And I think that's why you can make the argument that he's the most polished offensive version of himself that we've seen. That's a big deal. That comes with some strengths and weaknesses in terms of the players you put around him and how you can counter that in the postseason. Again, we talked about that last summer. But then on the flip side for me, Cody, it was a weaker defensive year for Giannis. And I don't think that's a trivial thing. I'm not sure what to make of that. That's what I'd like to discuss with you, because he's still a good defender. It's just not the same terrorizing presence that we saw in the past. And maybe when you only play half the season and your season isn't very competitive, that's a natural response to conserving yourself. We have seen players in the past. I am thinking of the reputation Kevin Garnett had in 2007 in Minnesota at the very end there, and then going to 2008. So maybe with Giannis in Miami with a fresh start, we're going to see, in fact, I would expect we see more terrorizing defense. And so if he has that capacity, where is he as a defender? How do we evaluate that in 2026? Is he still capable of being a top 5 defender in the league? Is he merely a top 10 or 15 defender? I think those are the big things to kind of try to figure out in terms of where this player falls in our hierarchy.
Yeah, his defensive fit to me is really interesting, because you talk about the defensive drop-off. I think it's pretty substantial in terms of how good of a defender we've seen from Giannis in the past, right? Like peak Giannis, of course, he has a much stronger defensive ecosystem, either Drew Holiday, Eric Bledsoe, and then like Brook Lopez dropping back. And I thought the dynamism between having just like a titanic paint protector like Brook Lopez and then Giannis's ability to also rim protect but fly around, I didn't quite see the motor that I saw. I didn't see him being able to make some of these impossible sorts of defensive recoveries that he's made. And I just didn't know if it was because Miles Turner's he's a good defender, right? But he's not going to be somebody that's a defense unto himself. And then like some of the guards, a lot of turnstiles are out there. I really like Ryan Rollins defensively. I think he has some interesting potential on that end, but it's not nearly what we saw at the Bucks peak. So I just don't know if like the fact that there were so many holes in the ship showed that Giannis can't duct tape it all together. And maybe you're right. Maybe being with like Eric Spoelstra, a very strong defensive core with Davion Mitchell, Andrew Wiggins, even Bam Adebayo, if we'll see a resurgence there again. But whatever it is that we saw, I was not particularly impressed compared to Giannis's peak on defense.
Yeah. So let's drill down on this a little bit. Do you still feel like he is a really good defender who, when you put together your all defensive team at the end of the year, accounting for his size and his position and his strengths, you go, okay, I have to consider that? Or are you thinking there's like a substantial, mid 2000s Kobe Bryant, like, yeah, we shouldn't be, this is not even for a guard, an all defensive kind of player?
If he had played the entire season at the level he was, I think you would, if you're making out like a long list of the all defensive teams, I think you'd still have to bring him up. Right?
Okay.
I think he's still a guy that needs to be considered, at least. Whether or not he makes a list, I'm not sure, but he would be in the conversation.
That's how I feel. I still think we're talking about a defender who is somewhere between good and very good. And just the hard part is just, did you allude to it earlier? This sort of just the mythical, these ethereal qualities in sports sometimes where you're looking at the player and you're like, yeah, I know that for most of this season, it hasn't been the same level of defense I'm used to seeing from Giannis Antetokounmpo in the past. But when we get to the playoffs, we're probably going to see something that is, or I expect to see something that in a playoff series can go to a level that most other players can't reach. And I'm not exactly sure how to handle that, because you don't necessarily want to gift a player something they didn't do during the year, especially as they get older. And like you said, it might just be a function of not being able to sustain that motor, not being able with age to keep up with the just insane level of pace and physicality that's going on in the league right now. But I still know what I've seen over the years, and I still have some sense of the athlete and how he rises to the moment. So I kind of still feel like Giannis is a very good defender to have on any team.
I'm thinking about what we just saw in the playoffs too, like a high level of physicality, right? Like all the teams were able to go out there and really rough people up, and Giannis would thrive in that, right? This is a guy that really enjoys contact, is huge, would be somebody that would be okay with that sort of thing. His weakness, I guess, when we're talking about, and this has always kind of been his weakness, and I think it's just getting more of a weakness as he ages here, is he never had, like, if we compare to like peak Anthony Davis defensively, right? Like the mobility of his hips, being able to keep up with people when he closes out on the perimeter, right? Guarding the pick and roll in that sort of scenario. I always thought he was a little lesser than like a top tier player, right? So I don't know. I could see him being attacked in those sorts of instances. But again, if he's able to get some of that recovery speed again, if he's able to ramp up into the playoffs and be, again, surrounded by a strong ecosystem, maybe he covers up some of those holes like we're able to see. So, yeah, I'm willing to say that he's still, like you said, a very good defensive player. And I would not be shocked if that's part of the conversation if he remains healthy throughout the entire season next year.
Well, I think another element of what we just saw in the playoffs is how teams are shrinking the floor so much and following what the Oklahoma City Thunder have led the charge on, which is use speed, get in the gaps, muck up everything, make it hard to get downhill. And yes, you will concede some threes. Yes, you will concede some corner threes. But Cody, you know what shot has the biggest drop off in the playoffs from the regular season to the playoffs? It is the semi-contested corner three. So as long as you can get back out and not give up that like 8-foot wide open corner three. By the way, the open corner three might also have a slight drop off as well. But it's an interesting thing that when we talk about shot quality throughout the year, those corner threes in the regular season, that is the highest value shot in basketball outside of layups and free throws for a lot of coaches and players. That's the perspective. Get the corner three. But when we go to the playoffs, the one thing that changes is like, it actually might be a little harder to shoot in the corners. And I don't have a perfect scientific explanation for that. Is it benches being up in the player's face and waving towels and screaming at them? Is it the crowd? Is it the fan? Is it there's more media, so the baseline's more crowded? I have no idea. Maybe it's the way you get a little extra energy in the postseason on your scheme where you know, hey, we're going to be in the paint. We got to get in real fast, then we have to get out real fast. But either way, I think a defensive scheme like that helps a player like Giannis Antetokounmpo in the playoffs with his defensive strength, because to your point, it covers up some of your weaknesses where you might be less likely to be 30 feet out on the perimeter on an island than you might have been a couple years ago. So to me, that's another thing to consider when it comes to Giannis.
I was going to try and pull the numbers up really quickly as you say this, but I'm pretty sure it was the 2019, 2020, 2021 Bucks Raptors era where when everyone was really starting to shoot some more threes, the Bucks started giving up more threes. Like they had one of the best defenses, but their whole scheme was like, we're shutting down the paint and we're actually going to open up some of these corner threes. And that turned out to be really successful when they moved into the playoffs. Like you said, like those become a little bit more difficult. Giannis has this incredible rangy ability to close out and shut some of that down. And then with all of that, Giannis, I think where he gets some bonus points here is you can play him in a few different positions on defense, right? Like when we pack the paint, you could see him playing like a 5 where he drops back. He didn't do a ton of drop defense. He can do the drop defense, but he does a little bit more flexible stuff. But you could play him there. You could play him next to another big. Heck, you could play him next to a couple other bigs if someone like Bobby Portis, who is part of the trade here, is one of those forwards, because you still get some of the spacing here. So I think that defensive flexibility gives him a boost because you can just see him in multiple roles in a playoff role.
Yeah, sounds good. What player would you like to discuss next? Because on my alphabetical list, go ahead.
No, keep going.
I was going to say on my alphabetical list, the next player to discuss we would start with would be Jaylen Brown. And by the way, my alphabetical list makes no sense because some players have first names and some players have last names, but that just makes it more fun. So Jaylen Brown is the next player. Would you like to make the case for him?
So what we saw, especially from Jaylen Brown this season with Jason Tatum being out, is a really strong bully ball, inelastic scoring punch that was able to buoy the Celtics offense throughout the season, right? And we always knew that Jaylen Brown wanted to get to this mid-range shot, that he could get to the basket. You know, something that maybe caught him a little bit more when we get to the playoffs is the arm bar. You know, he tried to pull that some more in the playoffs, and that was disallowed a little bit more. But he has the strength where even if you're playing this tighter, stingier, maybe even dirtier defense in the playoffs, he can bully himself to some of his spots a little bit more. So I think the scoring punch is incredibly valuable, right? Like if we were to be like, hey, who in the NBA do you just want to give the ball to as an isolation scorer? Jaylen Brown's probably up there. But I think he starts losing a little bit more points if it's like, we need you to spread the ball around a little bit more, extra passing, high-level reads and skip passes and stuff like that. So because of that, I don't see him as being like one of the top-tier offensive players in the league, but I still see him as being a strong offensive player paired with a strong defensive ability where you can throw him out, sick him on some guys, do some strong isolation defense, who also has some warts on that end. So I just gave you a lot of different points. I don't know which direction you want to go first with him.
Well, you're triggering a thought, which is that if you have a highly defensive roster, this is the classic example we use is Allen Iverson in the 2001 76ers, and you can really succeed defensively. The Derrick Rose Bulls had a similar roster construction. Then you need an offensive player to kind of heavy lift or floor raise your offense to just a certain height where you're not expecting to have alchemy on offense. You're not expecting to have a ton of players involved and have this beautiful, robust offensive system that is extremely difficult to defend in the postseason. Instead, what you're trying to do is you're trying to say, Jaylen Brown, like, go get your tough buckets, your ugly buckets, but get enough of them in big moments where our offense just gets to league average. And if you get our offense to league average, you're a good defender and you're surrounded with 4 other great defenders, and we're going to win with defense. And that's not a formula for a super team. It's not a formula for a juggernaut that's going to bowl you over and have no weaknesses, but it is a winning formula that sometimes can be good enough to get you a championship ring in a given season. And it sounds to me like that's what you're getting at when you say you don't really want him to be the centerpiece of an offense that has other good offensive players and is trying to really succeed by being a top 5 or top 2 offense, because the playmaking isn't quite there, or this style of play doesn't necessarily lend itself to mixing and blending with all these other players. We talked about this before. A slight weakness with Brown is you want him to be a better outside shooter. He's a solid outside shooter, but it's not like he's Klay Thompson out there when he's off ball or something like that. He's a pretty good cutter, pretty good offensive rebounder. I think his passing has improved. This is his best passing season, but it's still one of those things. I think what you're getting at, Cody, is that you don't want him to be like the number 1 offensive driving force on a team that you need to have be an elite championship offense.
Yeah, I always thought offensively, and especially this season, you talk about his passing improved. I think that connects with his handling improvement as well, where I thought he was a little bit tighter. I know the criticism with him has always been with that left hand, but overall, like, not even just talking about the left hand, it felt like he was a little bit more comfortable taking some tighter dribbles, right? Like, not just pulling up and being like, hey, I can slip in one more dribble so I can get to the basket here. And once I get close enough to the basket, I'm so strong and athletic that it's very difficult to stop me. So I think that opened up the game quite a bit more for him. And I think with that particular skill set you talk about, he was always a lot more comfortable attacking off the catch. Like, if you could swing it to Jaylen Brown and the defense is in rotation, he's comfortable enough taking the 3, even if it's a slightly contested. I always thought he was a solid contested shooter. He puts the ball on the deck in that sort of rotation. He thrives a little bit more in that. So it's almost like a play finisher next to some other guys that can stir the drink a little bit more. I like your Klay Thompson comparison. I was actually thinking right before you said that Klay Thompson at his peak is an interesting defensive comparison, right? Where it's like, if you have somebody out there who's like that, you're strong enough defensive player where you can defend multiple positions. You're not necessarily going to be a weakness. Defenses can't pick on you there, But when it comes to a lot of movement schemes, if you're putting a lot of different actions, you might get lost in the sauce a little bit in space. But overall, I think that grades out to be at least somewhat of a positive defensive player.
How much do you think Jaylen Brown actually improved this year as a player? You mentioned his handle. We mentioned some of his passing. I think what's interesting is probably outside of his mid-range shooting, which came back down to earth a little bit. He has these incredibly tough mid-range shots that he could get to, and he was just on a heater to start the year and in the middle of the year. But I think it is interesting to look at his overall statistical footprint, his statistical profile, and it looks fairly similar to the past. In fact, in many ways, it looks worse with his on-off driven data, any data that uses when you're on the court versus off the court, because this was one of his worst or was the worst year he's had taking Jason Tatum out of the lineup. Normally, you take Jason Tatum out of the lineup for 5 or 10 games at a time or for bench minutes or things like that. But this year, he just missed the whole year, and the Celtics were better when Jaylen Brown was on the bench than when he was on the court. We've talked about this extensively where, yes, there are legitimate reasons to see that as changing lineups and having to play harder units and shifting more players to play with the bench and letting Brown do that heavy lifting that we talked about. But, I mean, how much do you think he actually changed from like a 2025 or 2024 version of Jaylen Brown?
I do think the degree with which he improved his handle and then his passing is enough that like it's a slight boost. But I don't think necessarily that overall he's that much better of an offensive player. He's probably within the same range as before. But I do think this was probably his best offensive season because of those signals. But like you said, it's really weird because I tried to, as much as possible, use like 2 years of data when I was looking at some on-off stuff just so I can get a lot more. But then it gets complicated with somebody like Brown where it's like, well, last year's ecosystem looks a lot different from this year's ecosystem. So how can you connect that all together? But this year, we talk about this maybe his best offensive season ever. But then overall, like their offense is like half a point better per 100 possessions when he was on the court versus off the court. And I know that speaks to the Celtics and their incredible depth that they had and the way that Mazzulla was able to keep the drink stirring, and Derek White, who's just Derek White everywhere on offense. So I don't really know. That on-off stuff always gives me pause, but at the end of the day, I still view this as his best offensive season.
Okay, I agree with you. I think there was a slight bump in the things we talked about with his ball handling, his strength. The tricky part is probably what you started with, which is the officiating. Because for this season, you were just allowed to truck players. And I think this is important to draw a line in the sand and why we do recordings like this at the end of the year. Because if they change these interpretations of the rules, they're not actually rules. Nothing actually changes in the NBA rule book. They just interpret it differently. And you can't even figure out how they interpret it because the officials will put out points of emphasis. They will put them on the website. They will say, we don't want players stopping and veering into other players anymore. That's going to be an offensive foul. They will call it as an offensive foul for a month. And then they will just go back to calling it the exact opposite way of what's on their website. And I point that out to say, Jaylen Brown, with his physical upper body, his powerful strength, his tighter handle, and some of the straight line attacks that he figured out with the Celtics spacing, was really devastating, generating a bucket when they needed a tough bucket, even in games against high-level competition this year down the stretch. Spurs games, Pistons games, whoever it was. And then you get to the playoffs, and he's pushing people and doing the exact same thing, and he's getting called for offensive fouls. I personally think they are always offensive fouls, but it's kind of difficult to evaluate because you're like, okay, I want to bake in how physical it is, but also then when we get to the playoffs, you're not allowed to do that physicality, but you're allowed to increase other physicality in other areas of the game. Cody, I have another question. They called that in the first round. The first round to me was less physical than the second round, which was less physical than the third round, which by the time you got to the finals, there's just rugby. There were no rules. So it gets even weirder when you're like, with a player like Jaylen Brown, would he have just been allowed to shove everyone out of the way by the time they got to the finals? I have no idea.
Well, except for the Timberwolves first round series, they came out in finals form in terms of their physicality. So they just jumped ahead a couple of series with how they played the Nuggets.
Yes, I was thinking of the aggregate across the league, but yes, that's a good point. Yes.
But yeah, overall though, like I'm just looking through my notes right now, and a lot of times I flag as like such and such team is struggling to keep Brown out of the paint. I actually think there was a matchup against the Thunder, like you just talked about in March, where Brown really was having his way getting into the paint, into that pull-up jumper. And, I think we talked about it a lot during the season. He looked like Michael Jordan for a few months there. And I think he had an injury for a little bit, maybe a hamstring situation. And after that, the jumper kind of fell back to earth. But I don't think you can really gift him the Michael Jordan-esque mid-range jumper. But at the end of the day, it is still a weapon that was very effective for him.
All right, our next player alphabetically for me is Jalen Brunson.
Ooh.
And in the case of Jalen Brunson, something very similar to what we just talked about with Jaylen Brown, where you don't necessarily have a guy who you quarterback this incredibly robust offense with a bunch of different options. Yes, we talk about Brunson going off ball, but when he goes off ball, it's often to come back on ball. Brunson is not an off ball player who is getting off ball, bending the defense into knots and doing a ton of damage. He has a little gravity with those moves because you want to pay attention to him, but he's really just trying to get back on ball. So I think we're talking about more of a classic on ball quarterback that doesn't necessarily pass super well, but high volume scoring. It doesn't matter sometimes that the efficiency isn't there because, again, if you're dragging your team's offensive floor to where it needs to be, you just have this very resilient kind of playoff scoring. Defensively, we know he's a weakness. We know he's targeted. He's a small player, but he's a smart player, often leads the league in charges or is near that kind of top of that category. And I thought this year, the change in Jalen Brunson was not his offense. I look at his offense. I'm like, that's the same Jalen Brunson we've been looking at for the last couple of years. I look at the end of the finals run and I'm like, that's the same Jalen Brunson we expected for the last couple of years. Of course, he had 45 points in the championship game. Of course, he befuddled Wemby at times throughout the series. But the change to me was that he was a little bit better on defense, just a little bit smarter, a little bit sturdier, held up a little bit better. Sometimes when you get attacked for years and years and years, you kind of dial in how you want to defend that pick hunting, that switch hunting that teams pull you up into this pick and roll and try to hunt you in. And I thought he was a little bit better. So Jalen Brunson was someone we actually mentioned as a name in our honorable mentions last summer in the 21st Century Peaks. He was not someone we discussed as part of the 25 peaks that we ended up going through. But to me, very similar player to where he was, maybe just a little bit better on defense. And I think that's kind of the case for Jalen Brunson here.
Yeah, and if we talk about Jalen Brunson's offensive game, it is really weird because you look through. Listen, I'm actually going to backtrack a little bit. I'm going to preface what I'm about to say. It's tough to talk about somebody like Jalen Brunson right now because I really don't want to be a prisoner of the moment. But on the other hand, I don't want to be somebody that's trying to not be prisoner of the moment. So I have like the angel and the devil on my shoulders right now when it comes to somebody like Jalen Brunson. It's like, all right, where's the reactionary stuff? Where's the response to the reactionary stuff? Where can I actually land here? So I'm actually happy we're getting Brunson out of right away here because I do want to talk about some of the stuff. There was chattering throughout the season, like Karl-Anthony Towns isn't happy with his role. I thought there were some issues where like, oh, Brunson is maybe a little bit too ball dominant, et cetera, et cetera. But then we see it click in the playoffs. And I know we talked about this a little bit when the finals just ended, but I can't necessarily look at what happened there and say this is because of significant improvement from Jalen Brunson during these playoffs. Like you just said, it looked like the same Jalen Brunson from before. But at the end of the day, they produced an incredibly strong net rating, an incredibly strong offense. But that offense was through anyone that was on the court for the Knicks. You see Karl-Anthony Towns, you see Jalen Brunson. So I don't know how much of like a boost I can necessarily give him on the offensive end. But at the end of the day, there's an element to like, you talk about the mysticism of basketball. There is an element of an inevitability that his teammates almost banked on at the end of games when they were down by 10, when they were down double digits and things like that, that I also can't ignore. Like that felt really important where it's like, oh, whatever, we're just going to keep going back to Jalen Brunson. And even though overall he lost his minutes against Wemby, we can count on him to make some of these big plays. And we can count on him to be inelastic and we can count on him to be egalitarian when he needs to be. So I'm not really sure what to do all that, especially in relation to some of these other offensive forward guards that we're going to be talking about.
But does that feel different to you? Because that's the Jalen Brunson I feel like I've been looking at for not even 5 straight years. It goes back to Villanova as well. I mean, that's the thing I'm getting at. That sense of the big moment, the big shot. You just know he's going to show up after 2 sprained ankles. We've been talking about this repeatedly as a running bit for multiple years.
Yeah, I came across, I think I sent it to you. I think it was in 2022 we had discussion about the burgeoning excitement of Jalen Brunson for the Dallas Mavericks. So we were on top of this early on, but you're right. Like the same shiftiness we talked about in 2022 is there. The same step back ability is still there. The shooting ability has improved. He's a deadly outside shooter. So yeah, maybe you're right. Like maybe it's just the fact that he did it on the biggest stage that it stands out to me more here, but he's always been incredibly clutch. He's always been somebody that's been an inelastic scorer, even though he's at the height that he has. So yeah, you're right. There's probably not a huge shift in offense, and shifting him too much would probably be, as you like to cite, some form of winning bias.
I guess what I'm just asking you personally is, are you saying you feel more highly after watching this? Because I want to be clear. This is on offense, this is the exact same Jalen Brunson we've had for the last couple of years since we talked about him putting in the pull-up three-point shooting. He didn't necessarily have that off-the-dribble downhill pull-up three-point shooting a couple seasons ago when he came over from Dallas, and he made that a point of emphasis in his summer to put that in his game, and I think that added up to a significant leveling up in his offensive game in the playoffs. We talked about it before the finals. We talked about it every time the Spurs came up. And there was this sort of bit you had where it's like, this is it. This is the championship. Who can win? And every time that came up, I was like, the Spurs Knicks is a specific matchup because of Karl-Anthony Towns' spacing and because of Jalen Brunson's pull-up shooting and his style of play in the middle of the floor. And so I just want to be clear, for me, if you're listening and you're saying, like, what is Ben's assessment of seeing this and doing this every year for God knows how many years now and all that stuff, it's like, Jalen Brunson to me was the same a month ago as he was 2 weeks ago, as he was in Game 5 of the finals. On offense, I didn't see any upgrades in passing. I didn't see any change in style of play. Now, his style of play is very interesting because he does have some gravity. He does get into the middle of the floor. And despite that, I think because of his shooting, he does help open up the rim a little bit for his teammates with his statistical footprints. He's not a great playmaker, but he's centralized enough as a heliocentric hub and his style of play to consistently help his teammates over the last few years see an increase in their true shooting percentage when he's on the court. If you're familiar with our top 25 peaks of the 21st century from last summer, that's a stat I like to look at in large samples to get an idea of, like, where are you helping your teammates and how? Is there a material change in the teammates' true shooting percentage if we take your own shots out of it? And he does get a little bit of a bump, and I think that's why he's quite a good heliocentric offensive weapon as your centerpiece of your offense. Is it, again, we didn't have him in our top 25 peaks, so it's not at that level, but he's like a level below that, and I still think that's a formidable offensive player.
It is, and especially when you factor in the idea that he's not one of these Helio type of offensive players, that when he is off ball, he just, stands at half court or something like that. He does move around a bit more. He sets some strong screens because he's built like a fire hydrant, right? Like
he's
he can
a great
go in the
screener.
corner.
Yep. He's a great screener.
That all adds value offensively. But to your initial point that you're trying to ask me here, is that any different from last year? No, I don't think that part is different. So at the end of the day, is he probably the same offensive player as last year? Yeah, I accept that.
I'm not doing this just because of the Becky Hammond talking point. I'm just genuinely something that we've talked about before. As a small guard on defense, right? Do you think that is a massive limiter? Do you see him as a massive negative? Do you agree with me that he was a little bit better this season in this playoff run than I've seen him in the past? And then, by the way, then we're right back to asking, like, well, how much of that is Mike Brown? How much of that is changing the system? It's the same players as last year, but it's a slightly different system that I think really helped cover up the weaknesses in these playoff series with Karl-Anthony Towns and with Jalen Brunson. But also, this goes back to the matchup with a team like the Spurs. What is a type of matchup that we would see him really be exploited and hunted? It's like, take 2017 LeBron James and then say, please bring Jalen Brunson up to the pick and roll. And then you have to handle that out in space because it's just kind of like a one-on-one game. And if you have trouble avoiding that switch, it lets the ball handler like LeBron get downhill and playmake and be a dynamic playmaker. Luka Doncic would do this as well. And if you don't, and you get the switch you want, then that is a natural player playing downhill one-on-one as a playmaker. I don't know how many opponents the Knicks ran into that fit that bill. So it's the kind of thing I like to account for when thinking, what did I just see versus what could I have seen?
There is an interesting history with these smaller point guards posting at least some strong team defensive numbers. Like I think about Tony Parker with the Spurs all of those years. No one is going to make the argument that Tony Parker was a strong defensive player, and yet the Spurs were able to generate very strong defenses when he was on the court and when he was with them. But you can't go back and be like, it's because of Tony Parker's defense. And I do have to say that if you had asked me 5 months ago about Jalen Brunson's defense, which I think we talked about a lot, I was pretty adamant. Like I was the opposite of you. I thought the Knicks were really going to struggle and get knocked out earlier in the playoffs because you can't play Brunson and Towns together. And I thought they were both disasters on defense.
Right? No, I had this same concern, just to be clear. Yeah. We have to fall on this sword together. I said this many times. I think it's not just the competition they played. I think they did a really good job of having a scheme that protected both of those players, as well as the individual players themselves, understanding how they needed to execute in those schemes to defend at a higher level.
So with that said, I don't know how to take that idea that we talked about earlier in the season versus how the Knicks were able to play defense and what he was able to do, generating steals like he was able to do in the playoffs. I'm not sure where to marry all that. At the end of the day, do I still view him as a negative on defense? Yeah, I still think he's a negative defender. I wouldn't even put him as neutral at this point. But how much of a defender? I think that probably changed for me after the playoffs. I wouldn't call him a disaster, but he's definitely in the negative realm at this moment.
Okay, next player on my list alphabetically is Cade Cunningham. I guess we would get that with the CU in his last name or the CA in his first name. I told you guys these are written down randomly for me, but Cade Cunningham, and man, this is a very interesting one because he is a player who kind of plays with this ball-dominant heliocentric style that we've been discussing for the last half an hour or something, but Cade is a monster defensively for that position. If he's going to be your lead guard and you can lineup wise put whatever you want next to him, you can put another ball handler, you can put a shooter, you can put a shooter who can't defend like Duncan Robinson. There's all kinds of stuff you can put next to him because of that versatility. But then on the other end, he's a guy who I would consider for an all defensive team. He is a very, very good guard. Just to be clear, we have the positions. I know we don't have any positions anymore, but I'm old. Okay. I'm old and crusty. And I think, hey, remember when you used to have 4 guards on the all defensive team? Cade Cunningham would be someone I would consider at that level defensively. Big body, can protect the rim. Not super quick feet and like lockdown, super quick point of attack guards, but a lot of strengths defensively, especially with his size, the physicality of the playoffs. He's a big physical player on both ends of the court. But then on offense, the struggles in the playoffs where we know he's a great passer, but the passing almost seemed to come down a little bit in the postseason now. Is that a function of there's more gunk in the paint and Cade's strength as a passer, as you've articulated before, Cody? Is that outside to inside or inside to inside passing? And when you choke off the inside, it just doesn't come across as potent. It's just like, cool, you can kick out and hit some 3-point shooters. But even in their series, he was missing 3-point shooters. He's over dribbling the ball and looking to find the balance with his own shot. He's a very good scorer. You can run things through him, but not a great scorer at the highest levels. So he's a fascinating player for me because he is this archetype. But I think of someone like Brunson as clearly on another plane offensively in terms of the impact of the archetype.
That's interesting. They landed somewhat similarly to me, which became really complicated because, like you talked about, the defense is almost where I started with him. And
do you mean overall when you say that, or do you mean on offense?
I meant on offense.
Okay,
right?
So the discussion we just had about Brunson, you think Cade's in a very similar place offensively?
I do think he's in a similar place.
Tell me more about that.
So Jalen Brunson is a better shooter, right? Jalen Brunson is trickier and more wily and probably better at some of the off-ball screening stuff than Cade is at this point. But I just think about the offensive ecosystem we just saw with the Pistons. I mean, they were decrepit. It was terrifying, the sorts of stuff we were seeing. Like Asar Thompson was blocking everyone and stealing everything, but on the other side of the ball, I mean, I don't think Sar Thompson's going to appear in this conversation. Jalen Duren really struggled during these playoffs. Like Tobias Harris just straight up was like their second best player for the majority of what they were doing. And I thought being overtasked, being overburdened, we saw Cade make a lot of really dumb turnovers. Like the kinds of turnovers and the kinds of passes we just did not see. Like literally there were multiple passes like in transition where he throws it to his guy and like hits it right off his knees. Like the kind of stuff you'd see from like a 7th grader. And I'm like, this is not the Cade we saw all season. So I'm like, okay, what if he was just around a little bit better offensive players, right? Because he is doing so much and he is scoring at a really high volume and he's doing it efficiently. And I don't know. But like you're saying, if he is actually in the same realm as Jalen Brunson as an offensive player, this was the issue I ran into because I also view him so highly on defense. And I'm like, we're talking about like legitimately somebody that's going to be competing for one of the top spots on this list. And I don't know, I recoiled from that a little bit more. So I don't know, maybe I am all wet and maybe this conversation will shift me here, but you see him being a worse offensive player in a appreciable way than Jalen Brunson, right?
I think it's a level below. That's the best way to describe it. I think if Brunson's a level below the greats that we talked about over the summer, there's another drop off to Cade Cunningham. And frankly, I think the shooting is not something to be glossed over. That is a big reason why. Jalen Brunson, let's be clear, is a phenomenal shooter. He is an elite high-level shooter. If you look at his open shooting data, the way we track it, we have the 3-dimensional data that looks at the shooter's wrist and the defender's wrist and all that stuff. Jalen Brunson is like 49% on open threes above the break over the last couple of years. Okay. And he's been consistently improved this three, whether that real number in a super large sample is 46% or 48% or 40, doesn't matter. He's always near the top of the leaderboard. Cade Cunningham on those same above the break shots is like 37%. That is a massive difference, especially when Brunson's willing to shoot them at a much higher volume and probably a wider diversity of the shots he can get into because of that volume. So that actually, to me, is a huge, huge place with, yes, we can get into counters. I think Brunson has a few more counters in the mid-range. I think he's a little craftier. I think he's tougher as a shot maker. Cade offsets some of that with his size and his ability to play bully ball and get deep in the paint. He's got a nice short mid-ranger. But I think that is the difference. And if you could demonstrate to me that in a better ecosystem, Cade's passing is that much crazier, like it is, you get him a little bit more space and you get him the right weapons, and we are talking about truly a 2020s Jason Kidd level passer, then I think that would change the equation for me right now. But that's where I'm a little hung up in giving Cade that much credit or that much advantage as a passer or a playmaker, because yes, we know the ecosystem's terrible, but forget his scoring numbers, just the playmaking and some of the decisions and things like that. I didn't think they were as crisp as they will be in the future when he gets more reps.
And I think there were the flashes of the kid-like passing that we flagged throughout the season, right? Like I think Cade Cunningham is a much better passer than Jalen Brunson. Like I think there'd be in different levels in terms of that sort of passing creation, especially in the regular season, right? We just talked about, we did not quite see that as much in the playoffs. So maybe I'm gifting him too much of like the high level passes that I saw throughout there. And I am probably gifting him a little bit more in terms of like his strength and physicality. Because in my head, I'm like, all right, you can throw a lot of big defenders at him and he's going to be able to back down a lot of guys and figure things out that way. He can go to the LeBron ball type of thing and draw in defenders that way. So I saw different levels of offense that he could bring to the table that somebody like Jalen Brunson wouldn't be able to. But again, that's, you know, I'm starting to lean a little bit more in our conversation here where I didn't value the shooting differences quite as much. I didn't value maybe the ball handling to get into the middle of the paint as much and use some of that trickery to get to the free throw line, to get some of those open shots for his teammates. So I don't know. You are probably right about Jalen Brunson's offense.
That to me is probably the distinction. A quick data point on this for Cade Cunningham, because we talked about how great he was at passing his teammates into layups during the regular season. During the regular season, not only were the Pistons much better on the court scoring at the rim, but when you add in free throws, they scored 58 points every 100 possessions at the rim with Cade Cunningham on the court. In the postseason, that number went down to 43. Whoa. And it actually opened up in the 100 minutes Cade Cunningham sat, the Pistons went back to 53 points per 100 at the rim, which is not to say that in that small sample, I think Cade Cunningham is literally making them much worse scoring easy buckets. I just think it's to say there were things in the postseason that shifted. And in the regular season, we saw him help his teammates at the rim. Well, in the playoffs, that shifted to 3-point shooting. And his teammates not only took more threes in the playoffs, but they made those threes at a much, much higher percentage. Actually had a hard time shooting threes in the minutes he was off the court. Again, that could be just a super small sample, but it is a small data point to sort of suggest at this thing where I don't think he's quite found what the magic that he flashed in the regular season yet, at a level that I'm comfortable at saying, like, this overcomes your shortcomings in the shooting areas and the other areas relative to someone like Jalen Brunson.
I think that makes a lot of sense. But then the comparison point that I'm thinking about, I'm going to shift to defense for a second, is when you think about any of these like offense first guys that we're talking about, some of these lead creators and things like that, especially at the point guard position, his defense is so much higher than a lot of these other guys that I think that's going to skyrocket him a little bit more. And I think because of that, if we see some of these passing improvements come to fruition in playoff series, and he's able to showcase that an improved decision making and his shot maybe improves a little bit more, we're talking about like an incredible basketball player that could be competing for like, MVP year in and year out.
Right. I think that's about right. Yeah. His defense is just really fantastic. Next player on my list alphabetically is Wardell Curry. I mean, that's a W. That should be last. I guess it's the C. Steph Curry. And we talked a ton about him over the summer, of course, in our 21st Century Peak series. So I think we can be a little briefer on him. Mm-hmm. The issues with him are probably more about durability and age and health. And he's our first kind of senior statesman. And the question for me is, can these players hold up in a 4-round series? And if the answer is no, my immediate question is, well, then what would help them hold up? Would it be a 2014 Tim Duncan situation where you're playing 25 to 27 minutes a game versus being the guy who does the heavy lifting? If we look at the definitive Steph Curry footprint, which is using his gravity to make a layup machine out of his teammates, he still has a similar footprint that he's had for the last couple years. I do think he has that magic warping the court. No, it's not the same as when he was at his peak 5 to 10 years ago, but it is still quite a formidable weapon. Could he be your singular offensive player surrounded by a great team and drive you all the way through to the title? Again, I think that's much harder as he's aged. I think it's harder as his skills have eroded. I think it's probably hurt his defense a little bit as he's aged compared to where he was at his peak. But offensively, he is still almost a singular weapon and force when he is out there. So it's a question of how valuable is that still, even if it's come down quite a bit from his peak? And how do you get a team around him? What does the team construction look like for him to be kind of the 1B or whatever it is, where he doesn't have to play 38 to 42 minutes every game in some massive playoff series early in the playoffs or something?
Well, to answer your first question about how good is that offense, I still think it's pretty incredible. I think he is a top tier offensive player in the league right now. And even if he dropped off, I don't even want to give a percentage, but during our top 25 peak series last summer, I think I came out and said that I think Steph Curry is the best offensive player we've ever seen in the NBA. So if you shave even 80% off, 75% off the best ever, that's still really, really good. Like, we're talking about degrees here. And I think, like you said, he still has this huge footprint. If we go to a little bit more of a basic one, like even the last 2 regular seasons, when he's on the court, the Warriors are posting an offense that's about 5 points per 100 possessions better than league average. And his on-off signal is like a little over +9. It's still like a +9. And you look at basically anyone else, if you start to get like +5, +6, +7, like that's good. That's a very strong offensive player. But you flirt with double digits while your team is much better than league average when you're on the court. That's a phenomenal footprint. And he's taking, like these last couple of seasons, he's taking a higher volume of threes per 100 possessions than he did at his absolute peak. I think that has to do more with he doesn't have the burst to blow by guys. He still has the handle, but he just doesn't have that quickness. And I think that quickness does hurt him quite a bit, both, like you said, on defense and getting himself open off ball and whatever else for threes. But at the end of the day, the conditioning is still there. The 3-point fear that he instills in his enemies is still there. I don't know why I said enemies instead of opponents. Like it's war out here. Like it's getting very weepy talking about
We're getting
Steph
to
Curry
the second
out here.
hour. It's time to step up the language. Yeah.
We gotta stop get literary out here. But I don't know. I still think Stephen Curry is unbelievable as an offensive threat that I think could be the driving force of a championship level team.
I think that would surprise people if you told them the 2025-26 Warriors, meaning the last 2 seasons, have had a better regular season offense than the 2022-2023 Warriors, the team that won the title and then the team that lost in the second round in a very competitive series to the Lakers the year after. So to me, again, to your point, a lot of that is the swing with Steph Curry on the floor versus Steph Curry off the floor. And I just think he's still a singular weapon. It's just really a question of his age and how much he can hold up, and can he make it through a playoff series without getting injured. I mean, heck, last year they beat the Rockets. It was just this incredible performance to watch with the way the Rockets bent everything strategically, tactically, everything, throwing bodies at Steph, chasing Steph around zones where multiple players were with Steph at all times. That was the rule of the zone. Then they get to the next round. They're beating the Minnesota Timberwolves. They win the game. Steph injures his hamstring at halftime, right at the end of the first half, beginning of the second half, whatever it was. And then that's just it for the season. And I'm like, okay, well, that Curry guy's still pretty good. There aren't many better offensive players left in the league than Steph Curry. I'm not a huge one number guy these days, Cody. I mean, I'm having a hard enough time sort of collapsing everything down that we talked about into a single idea and saying, here's where this player ranks. But if you look at the public one number metrics we have, I think estimated plus minus from dunks and threes is probably the best that's out there. Gives us a nice snapshot of certain things going on. It does use plus minus and scoreboard data along with a ton of tracking data. And if you look at that, Steph Curry is 7th in the league this year in offensive expected EPM, basically tied with Giannis Antetokounmpo at number 6 at plus 5.5. And Nikola Jokic, the leader in that stat, is plus 6.4. So they're not too far off in the sort of guesstimations of that stat. And I don't know if you have anything else to say on Steph, but I think that's a good kind of bullet point to just realize, like, this is still Jalen Brunson, we just mentioned, is 9th right behind him. Jalen Brunson is 9th, but there's a drop off to Jalen Brunson is what I meant to say. He's down at plus 4. So Steph Curry's still a nuclear weapon.
So, yeah, I think it's time. We're like an hour in. I can start saying some things that people can get mad about. But out of all the guys we've talked about...
You did that earlier. Don't worry.
Oh, it's okay. We're getting... Now you got me running back. What did I say? But I guess we've talked an hour. You never know.
I have no idea what you said.
You never know. Something made somebody mad. It's like, oh, Ausar Thompson was actually a positive on offense. Whatever.
Yes.
Out of the guys we've talked about, I think Curry is pretty solidly the best offensive player.
Out of the ones we've talked about so far.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I think Jalen Brunson would be the closest for me, but I would still probably go with Steph. You just got to figure out if he can make it through 4 playoff rounds. Like, how does that work? If it works that you need better talent, you need the John Havlicek Celtics, or you need a deep ecosystem to still support the Tim Duncan 2014 Spurs and still support that great player. I'm okay with that. But I just also need to then do a little mental calibration and be like, well, what does that mean if you're only playing 26 minutes a game? Because I'm so used to thinking about your impact on a per minute or per possession basis, because I'm used to you playing basically quote unquote full minutes. Yeah. We've talked about this before. Some guys who can get up into the Allen Iverson, Kevin Garnett land of minutes, you got to give them a little boost. If you're in the Manu Ginobili land of minutes, maybe you just adjust that down a little bit. But that's my biggest question with Steph, is like, what's the ideal role and situation? And if it is reduced minutes, then does that mean like Brunson technically is a quote unquote better offensive player? That's where I get stuck.
And I guess if you compare them directly, like Jalen Brunson gets injured like 3 times a game and he just bounces back. And he's like, give me the ball again. I'm ready to go. Whereas like Steph has a history now of like that kind of knocks him out for the series.
Yeah. Next player alphabetically for me is Anthony Edwards of the Minnesota Timberwolves. And Cody, I'm going to let you take the lead on this one.
I'm just laughing because I know there's at least one listener in Minnesota that really perked up right now. He's like, he's got the notepad out. He's like, oh.
They were falling asleep. We had to bring him back in.
I've been waiting for this one right now just to see what's going to happen here. Anthony Edwards is he's really interesting because it feels like we talked about some of that on-off data, but it feels like he's triangulated kind of like a +7 on-off like since 2022. Like consistently his offense, his teams are like 7-ish, 6-ish, whatever it is. It's around that area in terms of how much better they are on offense, which makes sense because like whatever qualms I may have had about his shooting earlier on in his career, he's proven that like contested threes, pull up threes, step back threes, he is a very high volume, strong 3-point shooter, right? It's not the same kind of threes as somebody like Steph Curry. He's not flying off all these actions and drawing defenses that way, but it still provides a substantial amount of spacing because he can pull from it at any point. And it also helps him individually quite a bit because when he puts the burners on, right, he puts his head down and he drives. We're talking about one of the quickest first steps in the NBA, right? And you see that in the way that he's able to attack when he was healthy, I should say, when he was able to attack somebody like Nikola Jokic on the defensive end, like players like that really struggle to contain that sort of ability from him. So Anthony Edwards, I think still as a passer, like he reminds me of Jaylen Brown in this realm where he's very strong at scoring with the ball. I think he's very strong at catching the ball and being able to finish in a lot of different ways. But in terms of being like this mega creator to set up the offense as a passer, as a focal point, he's not quite there in my mind. But all of what I said still at the end of the day makes him a very solid offensive player.
He has this footprint that we talked about a lot last summer where he doesn't really help the team at the rim. He's not a great passer. He doesn't get into the guts of the defense and break them down that way. But because of the attention he draws that you laid out, he will help his teammates get more 3-point shots, get more open 3-point shots, and therefore make 3-point shots. And so there's some barometer of improving his teammates' shot quality in the regular season. There's some idea that he is a dangerous individual scorer. He's become a good shooter. You mentioned the numbers on his open threes. He's like 43% above the break. And if you look at that stat I mentioned earlier about how he influences his teammates' true shooting percentage, we're talking like 2 to 3%, which again is pretty good. It's a thing. It's a thing. This is a good offensive player, right? Can this be your number one driving force of an elite championship offense? That's the big question for me because I think of him as a good offensive player, but I still have some questions about, does he want to actually be out there with a primary ball handler? Should he be the primary ball handler? Should he be in a system where you have a big man initiating a lot of actions and he's playing off ball and you have multiple threats? Is it a 1A, 1B pick and roll kind of thing? I'm not entirely sure about that yet.
I need to correct myself. I looked at the wrong column here. I said that a lot of his impact was like +7-ish in offense. It's actually closer to like +4.5, +5, right? So it's a couple points knocked off here.
Yeah, it was closer to +7 this year, the last year or two. Yeah.
So I need to go back and correct myself. Everything else I said stands. And I think something that's really hurt him and his abilities on offense and the Timberwolves overall, Ben, it's something we've talked about for years now for the Timberwolves. They have not had a legitimate point guard for all this time. And Anthony Edwards ends up having to play a lot of point guard. And I think that's really out of position for him. That is not his strength. He needs to be quite a bit more off ball, even if he brings it up and gives it to somebody else to set the table, which is totally fine. But it would be like Jaylen Brown, like I said, trying to be the point guard for the Celtics. I think Anthony Edwards is probably a bit more better suited. He has a tighter handle, I think, but a lot more of the decision-making qualms. Like you see people throwing doubles at Anthony Edwards, and he kind of makes the basic pass. Like he's not passing his teammates open. He's like, oh, one guy's one pass away. And then he can kind of stand there for a second. Like, I'm not 100% sure what I'm going to do here. And I think he's just a lot more comfortable starting off ball and scoring in that realm. So Edwards would probably have a better impact, a better footprint throughout his career if he had somebody that could set the table a little bit more here. So that's where I stand with him offensively. Do you have anything else to say about him offensively? Because I think his defense is interesting here too.
Yeah, I think if we go in the other direction and we look at possible weaknesses here or things that are limitations, you mentioned being double teamed, but also a lot of that stuff that we just talked about plays really well in the regular season. You get into the playoffs and you have some tough shot making that seems like it's really good. You have some pull-up shooting. You have some improvement in his playmaking off the dribble, but also the totality of it over the multiple playoff series that they've played in the last few years has not been great. And he has struggled when you look at the total number of shots, the total events that have happened when he's been out of the lineup. He's sat, I should say, for 500 minutes in the last 3 years. So it's not a super tiny playoff sample. We've seen this in multiple series where his teammates have come in and continue to drive the Minnesota offense. The Minnesota offense has a lot of pretty good shooters, a lot of slashers, a lot of athletes. And if you get matchups like that against a team like Denver, I mean, they literally won the series without Anthony Edwards this year. So I don't know how many people know this, but in the last 3 years, the Minnesota offense in the playoffs has been technically slightly better when Anthony Edwards has been on the bench than when he's been on the floor for those 500 minutes. And this might be the biggest stat of them all. Cody, what do you think the offense was relative to what the defenses gave up in the regular season? Was it a +5 offense? Were they scoring 120 against 115 defenses? Or was it +3, +7, -5? Where do you think it fell?
I'm going to say -2 here.
Okay, your instinct is pretty good. It was basically dead neutral. They scored the exact same as their opponents gave up. So the point is, this is not a particularly good offense. In that first round series against Denver this year, I know they had really good quote unquote outside shooting or shooting luck that is independent of Anthony Edwards. And that's another thing it goes back to the Jalen Brunson point. Like, you're always trying to look at how the player played and the pass he delivered. And somehow in your brain divorce that from Landry Shamet making 91% of the shots that he gets at the end of that pass. Because you mentioned winning bias, the psychological hunch we have as analysts, as fans, as coaches, whatever, is to look at that, look at the score sheet, feel the rhythm of that game. You called it inevitable earlier and be like, I got to sprinkle some of that magic dust value on Jalen Brunson. But it's like, Jalen played the exact same. Just cut everybody else out of the film and watch how he played. And I feel like Anthony Edwards has this going where Minnesota has had a lot of success because of their defense, because of Rudy Gobert, because of their athletes, because of their matchups. And yet, in the postseason, I still think there are some legitimate weaknesses that make me question, is Anthony Edwards even like a really good playoff number one as a driver of deep, successful playoff offense? And secondly, defensively, he has these flashes as a man defender. He has these flashes getting up and protecting the rim. But as we've discussed and looked at before, there's also some weaknesses in the team setting, in the attention and things like that. So I'm not in love with him as a defender either. And I think that creates a very uncertain kind of range for what to do with a player like this.
I'm not in love with him as a defender, but I think it's pretty clear to me that he's a positive defensive player. Right. Like he brings value on the defensive end, especially when you have him surrounded by other very physical defenders, by rim protectors and stuff. He's only additive in that sense. The way, like you just talked about, it's the same sort of thing with Jaylen Brown, not extremely strong with defending out in space, lots of different actions and things like that. But again, his incredible athleticism, his incredible speed, jumping passing lanes, getting up into somebody's body, picking passes like that, getting out in transition, that all is very valuable to me. He's strong enough as a guard that you can't pick on him in the post. You can't really pick on him in the pick and roll, in isolation or things like that. But it's sort of like this global team schematic stuff that we talk about with him. But that still grades out as a positive defender, especially relative to some of these guys that we're talking about.
Okay. Do you have any other final points on Ant, or should we move on to the next player who may or may not be in the alphabetical order he should be in?
Let's talk about this next player. You got me intrigued.
Okay. Well, it's a perfect transition to the player you said he was cooking, which is Nikola Jokic. And Nikola Jokic, of course, has been, I think we know the drill at this point. We've talked about him extensively, all-time dominant level offensive player. And the question is, what is he as a defender? Is he weak in certain matchups? Does he need the right defensive players around him? I remember, Cody, during the playoffs, you were like, is Aaron Gordon like really that important to what's happening in Denver? Do you need Aaron Gordon and Michael Porter Jr. and size? Do you need Kentavious Caldwell-Popes of the world and things like that to help shore up some of these weaknesses? It's a similar thing with Jalen Brunson. It's a similar thing to a teammate like Karl-Anthony Towns that we talked about, that ecosystem and what it makes us think of the strengths and weaknesses of these players when they're very polarized. And I don't mean the fan reaction. I mean, when you look at them and you go, yeah, Jokic has great hands. He has great communication, or I should say good. Sometimes he can be a little lazy. He has a great mind, positions himself well. He can take charges. He's a fantastic rebounder, and he doesn't foul. And those can all be really, really additive things. He can have really good defensive games in series, legitimately, and the Nuggets defense, when it has the right pieces, can be very good. On the flip side, he has many weaknesses. He's not that mobile. As a big man, he does not play vertically to protect the basket quite a bit. He cannot handle a lot of athletes coming downhill into his body in these situations. So you get very polarized results is basically where I'm going.
Yeah, I do think, though, first half of the season, Nikola Jokic, I don't know which way to go. I'll get to offense in just a second. But he looked absolutely unstoppable through the first half of the season. He had that injury, comes back. I did think defensively, everything that you're talking about, this is probably the worst I've seen Jokic playing in a couple of years. Like, I don't even know when I would go back to say it, but I've seen Jokic, especially during the championship run and the surrounding seasons there, I've seen him be a little bit more. Like, this is the most that I watched him and felt overall. This is probably a slight negative of a defensive player, right? And that's ultimately where I graded out watching him.
On that particular point, do you think that's for the whole season and just he's older and the motor's a little lower and he's a little lazier, if you will? Or do you think that was after the injury? Because offensively, before the injury, I think it's like, this is maybe the best regular season offensive player we've ever seen. It was ridiculous. And then there was some clear decline, I felt, in terms of his movement and his comfort and his touch. Did that translate to defense, or are you just talking about the whole year?
I'll be honest with you. I don't know off the top of my head to differentiate enough between the two. I just have the memories of what I saw in the second half. So it's probably more aligned with the second half of the season, but I can't say definitively that it's different from what I saw in the first half.
Okay. But in your head, you are leaning on the negative side of his defensive impact for this season, which might be a slight departure from where you've been the last couple of years.
Yeah, I would say I always graded out maybe neutral, maybe slightly positive. I wouldn't say he's a disaster by any means. This isn't a huge negative. I'm talking like slightly on the negative end here. Like you said, all the other things that he does so well defensively, like we're seeing a value add in terms of defensive rebounding here. So one could maybe make an argument that being a very strong defensive rebounder is more valuable than earlier in his career. And I think that would be an interesting thing that somebody would be able to say, but he's always at least mentioned in the hands category and the thinkies. Like you said, his awareness, being able to blow up actions, knowing what teams are doing, that's all extremely valuable. But like you said, we saw somebody like Anthony Edwards take advantage of some of those weaknesses. I would assume who take advantage of some of those weaknesses in not being able to defend in space as well, not protecting the paint and things like that.
Do you have an opinion on the playoff offenses of the Nuggets being disappointing? We talked about this last summer a little bit, but this series against Minnesota, and of course we talk endlessly about how much they struggle against Minnesota and how it's a tough matchup. But I mean, literally this series against Minnesota, they had like a 109 offensive rating and the Timberwolves gave up 113 in the regular season. So that's a big win for the Minnesota defense against a Jokic-led offense. At the same time, they did have, I think, the worst shooting luck of anyone in the first round. And we calculated it last summer, and we were talking about the teammates' shots. So Jokic is setting up these teammates for, let's say, the same number of wide open threes, and they're just missing in a smallish sample more threes. Does it give you consternation? Do you watch the X's and O's of a playoff series and feel like they have Jokic more figured out and that his style, that middle of the floor, two-man game, hub, short mid-range post style is less effective? Or do you think it's just kind of noise?
I think there's a bold take here, Ben. But if
we're in the second hour, Cody, so we got to let it fly. Yeah.
We can say whatever we want.
The freak flags are out. Let's go.
If the Nuggets did not play the Timberwolves in the first round of the playoffs, there's a chance they're contending for the title, right? Like, I stand by that. I think the fact that Aaron Gordon wasn't Aaron Gordon holds them back quite a bit, but there is something we talk about the style makes fight here of these playoffs, the way that the Wolves are able to, 94 feet of somebody like Jaden McDaniels on Jamal Murray, blowing up like his ability to bring it up, blowing up any creation that anyone else has on the team. Because that's somewhere where they really struggled. They just did not have a lot of guys that you could give the ball to and be like, hey, we need to run some offense through you, bring the ball up, get into some action with Jokic, things like that. And then when you choke off all of the other points that way, you have Rudy Gobert, who's just a tremendous one-on-one defensive player. I think Jokic did a pretty solid job against him, actually, as the series went on. But it's just a team built for and schematically interested in and personally desirous, I don't know how you want to say that word, of making a mockery of this Nuggets team. And so I think this is just the worst possible matchup of a team that just goes against them so absolutely well. The thing that does give me some pause, though, and I said this during the 25 series as well, the three-point shooting, I just don't know what to make of it with Jokic. Like, let me just read the last few playoff seasons of Jokic's three-point percentage. This year, 19% from three. Last playoffs, 38%. 2024, 26%. 23, 46% from three. The year before that, 28%. I just don't know. And it feels like he can get into his head and not want to take it and start clanging a few of them. And that just takes a little bit of shine off it. So I'm just not sure what to think of it in the playoffs. All I know is the regular season numbers are ridiculous. And the Timberwolves are just very well put together to defend the Nuggets.
I also kind of think the physicality might be cutting against Jokic a little bit because we see smaller players bang with him. We see no freedom of movement off ball. He's such a good cutter. But even in a series like Gobert, I don't know if more of those would have been called fouls 2 or 3 years ago. I thought Rudy did a great job and was really inside the lines. I didn't think he got outside the lines of what they were calling, but there is more physicality, and Gobert's a big, strong, physical dude. Mm-hmm. And he was able to use his body on possessions where the Timberwolves weren't sending extra help. And that single coverage was a big, big element to kind of choking off that Magic Nuggets playoff offense. I mean, we can say what we want about Aaron Gordon being out of the lineup. I think that's a factor. We can say what we want about losing guys over the years like Kentavious Caldwell-Pope or 2026 Bruce Brown not being 2023 Brucey B. I mean, I do think there's elements of the supporting cast here that are really important, but also at the same time, man, like Rudy Gobert was awesome. And I'm not 100% sure if it would have been the same effectiveness 3 years ago. So it's another thing because it goes beyond Gobert if you're going to meet other defenses that are allowed to be really, really physical. Like your hot take about the Nuggets being a championship level team. Let's say they play the Knicks in the finals. I mean, Karl-Anthony Towns just going to maul them, right? And I think Karl-Anthony Towns physically might hold up much better than he would have 2 years ago or 3 years ago or even last year. I can't keep track of how fast the playoffs and the officiating is changing, but I don't know if you buy that at all. I'm not necessarily buying it. I'm just throwing it out there.
Interestingly, actually, I don't know if it was the 7-game series where the Wolves were able to come back in game 7 to upset the Nuggets a couple of years ago, but I thought Karl Towns did a tremendous job defending Jokic in spaces. So he's actually somebody where he does ramp up his physicality in the playoffs, and when he's allowed to do that and defend one-on-one, he has a little bit more value there. So I think that point is well taken in terms of how effective he could be in the playoffs. Can I read you a bonkers regular season number, though? I know we've done it all with Jokic, but I just need to say this. I need to contextualize this. So out of like these 30 guys that I looked at here, right? Jokic, I'm going to toss Jamal Murray out because he's actually number 2 on this list, and there's just the synergy between them. If you look at how successful all of these players are, how good their offense is relative to league average when they're on the court, if we kick Jamal Murray out and we go down to number 3, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, when he's on the court, the Thunder's offense is 8 points better than league average, right? Then you have Jamal Murray. When Jokic was on the court this season and last season, their offense was 12 points better than league average. 12 points better than league average. And here's the kicker. His on-off, their offense was 16 points per 100 possessions better when he was on the court versus off the court. So he basically floor raised to the absolute maximum of the ceiling these last 2 regular seasons. So it doesn't matter how you slice it. The regular season numbers are still unbelievably bonkers with Jokic.
I think we should just segue. It's right here on my sheet. Karl-Anthony Towns, K,
right,
comes after J, because we've talked about him. He's a really interesting player in that I don't think there's been too much debate about how effective he is on offense. I mean, if you ball watch and you're a big box score guy and you get into the points per games, the PPGs, Cody, then maybe you're underwhelmed by Karl-Anthony Towns. But you're talking about one of the great big men shooters of all time, can space the floor, can punish mismatches with the power drives downhill when they come out on that shooting, has a little bit of a post game as well, and is a good passer. And that was, of course, huge to the Knicks in the playoffs, unlocking that extra dimension by playing more through Cat as a hub and having him execute some of those passes. And so you have a player that when he runs cold is a good offensive player, when he runs hot and things are going well, is a great offensive big man, can space the floor, gives you all these elements. And the big question has been like, how disastrous is this guy's defense? And of course, in the playoffs, we just saw his defense not only held up, but statistically, like if you just look at the numbers when he's on the court for these small samples and when he's off the court and you go to these traditional sort of things, if you were naive, you would look at it and you go like, well, Victor Wembanyama and Karl-Anthony Towns, those must be the two best defensive players in the NBA, right?
Yeah. And I'm still not sure what to make of it, because with the increased physicality that you just talked about, Towns is huge. This is a massive dude, right? And he, on top of being strong and physical and being very willing to bully players as much as possible, he also is able to block some shots, right? Like players get out into the paint, right? I think I said it right after the series, but he's not deterring players from the paint, but you get a shot up around them, he can still get his paw up there and knock it away. So he held up in terms of like, he didn't seem lost. He didn't seem bullied. I didn't see a lot of the possessions where I'm just like watching Towns, like, what scheme are you in right now? So it felt the same way as the Jalen Brunson conversation that we just had, where I expected more of a disaster. And I'm still not 100% convinced that Karl-Anthony Towns isn't somewhat of a disaster on defense. But whatever we just watched during this finals run, during this championship run, it's definitely better than I expected.
Yeah, I still don't know what to make of it. I think we need next year. I think we need next year's postseason. If you just look at Karl-Anthony Towns' history, both in the regular season and the playoffs, it just looks one way forever. And then you get to 2026 and it looks like a completely different player. And on one hand, that is the classic small sample trap. I mean, that's what a small sample is. It's when a player who's shooting really poorly, it's when Antoine Walker goes 8 for 9 in a game. You don't just go, Antoine Walker is an 89% three-point shooter. So there's an element of that, but there's also another element, which is Mike Brown's a new coach, and he's clearly changed some things. Karl-Anthony Towns is an older player. He clearly has a little bit more maturity. The Knicks have been together longer. They clearly have more continuity. Jalen Brunson does have a leadership style that has taken hold on that. All these things are there. So that's why I'm like, I just need to go right to 2027 and see what to make of this, because on film, which I trust more in the small sample as I think we should, there are some things that he's doing better. And there are moments where I think that team system is really helping him. But I mean, for instance, you mentioned block shots, right? Mm-hmm. Did he block like one shot a game?
It wasn't a massive number.
Yeah. No, I'm saying it's literally a small number for a center who has good rim paint protecting numbers. And if you just look at the Knicks defense, as we talked about last week, the Knicks defense statistically in their 19-game title run is one of the best single postseason defenses of all time. But I don't know how much we can take everything at face value. As an example, OG Anunoby, who we won't talk about today, great player. But he's not you can't shoot 72% for the course of the year. Right now, if OG Anunoby comes out for the rest of time and just shoots 48% from three and suddenly becomes the best shooter ever and shoots 72% on all his shots, true shooting wise, then we have to get that. That's who he is. Yeah. But to do that in a small sample is something that I don't think we can take at face value, or else we would be talking about OG Anunoby today, because that would make Reggie Miller look inefficient. That would be ridiculous. Plus, Cody, would you like some plus 17 true shooting as a volume scorer?
Oh, you don't think that's something that OG can do? I knew you flabbergasted me, bamboozled me. I'm losing words now. Bamboozled me on the last episode where you asked me who is more efficient in the playoffs with 20 points per 75, and the answer was just OG. It's him in a class of his own. But at the end of the day, though, like, you have to. Part of me thinks that you have to take some of these data points and be like, okay, I have to move a little bit in a positive direction here, right? Like, the way that I think about Towns' defense is better than before I started the playoffs. Do I still view him as a negative? Yes. Is there a potential that he is still, maybe in a lot of systems, a disaster on defense? Absolutely. But it's still, mildly better. When we talk about the margins of a list like this, that kind of stuff does matter quite a bit. It moves you a little bit, especially when you're such a massive mover on the offensive end. But yeah, I guess that's my take on it. It's not like I magically think that Towns is a positive defender, right? He's just not as much of a disaster as I thought before.
But I think in my head, he's pretty close to neutral. I mean, we talked about Jokic vacillating between, is this something we'd call a quote unquote slight positive or a quote unquote slight negative? I think I think you can make the argument that he might be a slight positive defender now. I'm not saying I'm super comfortable with that argument personally, but the space in my head, right? Or are you just you're not even near that? You're still like, this dude's clearly bleeding everywhere.
That made me uncomfortable to say a slight positive. I don't know if I can get there even on like my highest of high end. I still think I'm leaning like a negative. You know, I wouldn't say a slight negative. I'd say negative, but I'm also not saying a disastrous negative.
Okay. Next up, we have, let's see, Kawhi Leonard, who we discussed, of course, last summer, but that was a different version of Kawhi Leonard. So trying to be brief on these players that we've done deep dives on. I just thought in the regular season, he became such an interesting scoring machine for the Los Angeles Clippers offense. I mean, you want to talk about a player that you could get big time shots on, could make big time shots. You could run the offense through. You could just have him go out there and make a massive difference on your offensive unit. I believe he was third overall in estimated plus minus this year. He was second overall in offense, just behind Jokic. And it's not as cut and dried for me because he does have this thing where he's not helping his teammates a ton. He plays in this style where, he's going to get into the middle of the floor. It's a little similar to Jaylen Brown. We've talked about it before with Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Have we not gotten to Shai yet? I guess he begins with S. We haven't gotten there. But like Kawhi is this great offensive player who I think has this very resilient type of offense. I think he can get it off ball and go right into a move. You run a down screen for him. He goes right into a move. He's very quick. He's very economical in getting into his actions, but he's also not a great passer. It's a really interesting type of big time offensive player. Then there's the fact that he's not the defender he used to be, but he's still a good defender. He's a big, huge, strong, physical guy who made really important defensive plays this year. He did take on defensive assignments at times during the season that were really important for the Clippers, almost getting into the final 8, making that huge run to turn their season around. And lastly, but not least, we have the health age. Can you make it? We have another player, and Kawhi's on the younger end. So I kind of feel a little more comfortable with Kawhi playing a normal heavy lifting role. But of course, we've seen his injuries act up over the year. He did play, 65 games this season, and I thought he looked the best he has looked in maybe 5 years since that run to the Western Conference Finals the Clippers made in 2021.
There are 2 players that we're going to talk about today. I hope the other one comes up. 2 players that I'm the least confident in talking about, and Kawhi is one of them. I feel like, there's the numbers, there's philosophically what I think about basketball. There's what I see on the screen, right? And so when I look at some of you just talked about EPM, some of the on-off stuff is great. Like when he was on the court these last couple of years, the Clippers are like 7 points per 100 possessions better than league average. And he has like a +8 on-off number, like just incredible numbers, just a huge engine, just moving the offense in that kind of degree. But you watch him play, and I feel like he's such a low revving engine on both ends of the court, right? Like you said, economical. So there's an economical, and there's also just like not really flying around at all, right? Not making a lot of actions, off his speed or off his conditioning and stuff. Kind of catches the ball and methodically gets to his spots and makes them. Defenses have to fly around and get to him because he's just such an incredible, tough shot maker. He gets to the basket at a fair amount, just because he is so ungodly strong where he could just kind of bully through people and finishes through them. He has the MJ thing, like the secret to MJ's finishing was just the mitts that he had. And Kawhi has the same sort of thing. He can just get up there and you knock him off and he still has it in the one hand. He's able to finish. So you see all of the scoring things in that way. But when I think about a global impact for an offensive player, right, it's not like teams are selling out because they're so afraid of his spacing. It's not like he's opening these incredible layup passes for his teammates to get some easy shots for his guys. It's not like he's spraying it out in like a Tyrese Halliburton where he's opening up all these, opportunities either in transition or the 3-point shots. I just don't know what to make of all of that. I don't, because the numbers are saying one thing, the shot making is saying one thing, but there's a lot of the other latent value that I'm not seeing, and I'm actually kind of shocked to see the numbers saying what they're saying. So that's what I have to present for him.
Okay, I want to read you some numbers that you may or may not already know, and I want to try to keep it as simple as possible. The first player averages 34 points per 75 possessions. On true shooting, 4 percentage points better than the league. So he's 34 plus 4.
Okay.
34 plus 4. His team's offensive rating when he's on the court is 121 this year.
Yep.
Okay. The second player is 33 points per 75 plus 5. 33 plus 5. His team's offensive rating is 123 when he's on the court this year. One of those players is Kawhi Leonard. The other player is Luka Doncic. Which one is which?
I think Kawhi is the first one.
Kawhi is the second one.
Kawhi is the second one.
Yes. It's slightly more efficient on almost the same volume, and their team's offense were better when he was on the court. So I'm with you. We talked about this. He's not going to have a massive effect on his teammates' shot quality. He's not going to dime them up at the rim, but he is a whole type of thing that we've seen in the playoffs before, that you need someone, again, this is like a theme today with Jalen Brunson, with Cade Cunningham. You need someone to play that role and kind of floor lift your team. Only in Kawhi's case, I think, as we talked about last summer, he can fit because he's so economical, because he can catch it off ball on curls in the short mid-range, in the post, in a mismatch, get a steal, in transition, 1 dribble, 2 dribble shot, quick decision, coming from that Spurs lineage. He can kind of fit with other players as well without having to be that guy. So I think he's a very compelling case that he's still one of the best offensive players in the league in his own right.
I think you're absolutely right about all that. It's just when I watch him play basketball, I don't necessarily get that feeling. It's almost like my eye test is lagging with him compared to a lot of the other data. Like, I'm more willing to believe a lot of the data, but I don't know. Do you see my point, though, with the latent value sort of thing, with the lack of passing compared to other huge offensive engines, the lack of immense spacing and gravity compared to other offensive engines? Do you kind of understand where I'm coming from with that?
I think those are fair points. I do think in the playoffs, he's going to need quite a bit of game planning. You can't have weak defenders on him in the playoffs. And I think some of these actions that the Clippers have run for him involve trying to put, much like the Spurs did with Wemby, trying to put a weaker defender in the screening action, and then saying, like, if you're not going to switch this screening action, it's going to be a curl, and Kawhi Leonard's going to have a little open 10-footer. And if you are going to switch this screening action, then it's going to be minced meat because he's too high. I don't know how much he weighs. He's just a tank. He's so strong.
Yeah.
And the strength that these players have against this physicality, I think, is something that has graded out very well for Kawhi this season. The hardest part for me with evaluating Kawhi is just like, where is he now at this point in his career? He just looks better than he has in 5 years. I disagree a little on the eye test, because as the season went on, he just kept looking better and better and better. You're like, what is going? Is he like this is crazy how well he's playing. We just didn't get to see it over a sustained playoff run at this age with this version of the player.
I think Kawhi is the king right now in the NBA of, if you're a young player and you're trying to watch some players to emulate, you want to be like them, borrow stuff from their game, don't do that with Kawhi. Just don't. Like, there's a singular brilliance to the way that he's able to play offense and his tough shot making and his strength and things like that. That's just really, really kind of impossible to replicate. So I think that's almost where I'm coming from there. He's such a unique offensive player that it's jarring to go from somebody else like a Jokic or even like a Brunson and seeing somebody like Kawhi and being like, man, this is really effective offense. So maybe that's my take about Kawhi.
Well, I think the people are going to perk up on this next player I have written down. LeBron James is 41 years old, and there's just no way around it. He's still extremely good at basketball, and in a playoff setting, he is still extremely valuable. Again, we have the big question at his age: can you do it for 4 intense rounds? Number one, and number two, if you were on a better team, I think we started to see it with the Lakers this year, but what would it look like as maybe a guy who could be the second best player on the team? And therefore, does he get to play 32 minutes sometimes? I mean, when the situation they had in Los Angeles, it was crazy. He's like, I'm getting tired watching. He's like 44 minutes a game or whatever he has to play against Houston in that incredible first round series. But I think we still have a very dynamic playoff offensive player who can outthink you, and therefore where you have a gap, he can punch that gap. And I don't mean driving lanes. I mean, like, where you have a hole, he's going to find a little key to put in that hole and poke at it and work it. And whether it's passing, posting up, transition, off ball cuts, he's like a coach on the floor. And that allows for some positive defensive stuff as well, even though he's older and has limitations, because of that communication, because of that game planning awareness. Cuts both ways in a playoff series, and I think it's still present even at his age.
This was the second player I was talking about in terms of not really being sure where to land with him. Because you're absolutely right. Like, we're talking like a GOAT level mind out there. Obviously, he's one of the greatest players of all time, potentially the greatest player of all time, right? And so just through his thinking, just through being able to pick apart defenses, like, oh, you're going to defend me this way? I only need to see it once. I got you figured out. Bang. I took advantage of it, right? Oh, you're giving me this space. I'm going to go here, and I know you're going to do this, and I'm just going to play chess with you, right? And he's the absolute master at it. The kick aheads, setting up early offense, just like you said, knowing every avenue to try and get off efficient offense, setting up his teammates, things like that. What I don't understand, though, is, and this is the number I've been going back to a couple of times so far in today's episode, but you look at the last couple of seasons, when he's on the court these last two seasons, their offense is like 1.5 points better than league average. And you know what the shocking part has been? They're actually, they're better when he's on the bench. Their offense has been better when he's on the bench. And even these last playoffs, and I know that's probably a small sample size aspect, because we haven't seen it in past series, but even in these playoffs, their offense was better when he was on the bench. So I don't know what to do with 2 regular seasons of data where that's the case, along with the playoffs this season where it's the case. And, you know, we see a drop off in his own scoring ability and the volume that he was able to ramp up to in his past years. So I think my big question with him is just how good of an offensive player are we actually talking about here?
Yeah, it's not the same, though. It's not the same type of offensive player we've seen in the past where you're asking him to drive the entire offense as a ball dominant force and do everything. I think it's more of this Swiss Army knife thing that we've seen where he can run some pick and roll. He can isolate on the mismatch. He can go to the post. Going to make all kinds of Magic Johnson-y kind of passes, meaning he's not Luka Doncic getting downhill in the pick and roll 60 times a game and going, lob at this window. If the help comes over, corner skip. If you don't, I'm going to dunk it on you or get free throws. It's more like bringing it up in transition. Oh, look at that. Marcus Smart is 2 feet behind his defender, 51 feet away on the other side of the court. I'm going to throw it over there and something good might happen. And he does a lot of something good might happens throughout the playoff game, especially when he can scout the opponent's weaknesses. So I think it's a very unique kind of offensive player. I think it is a Swiss Army knife type of offensive player, to use words that we've used so many times over the years. I think it is a very portable type of offensive player. It fits in a lot of different places. And we've seen that this year in terms of him trying to find a role next to Luka Doncic, find a role next to Luka Doncic and Austin Reeves. And then in the playoffs, he's like, I'll just try to do it myself, I guess. But also, to my point, he couldn't just do it himself the way he used to. He had to find a way to empower Marcus Smart as creating some offense. They had to find a way to empower Luke Kennard as being a focal point at times for some offense. So I think it's a very unique type of offensive player, Cody. And it therefore makes it hard to really put a valuation on, to put a number on. It's difficult.
Yeah, so when you take all of that, we've talked about some other offensive engines. I can't quite get them up to that point. Like, we talk about a very good offensive player, but like, you know, I think a lot of these other guys that can take on quite the burden of like, I'm creating a lot more through my passing, through my scoring, in situations like that, they're going to grade out, to me, higher than him. But I think the thing that still helps him, and I think it hurts him more in the regular season, I think there's a lot of lapses with his defense. He just doesn't have the lateral quickness anymore, right? He can still rise up and block some shots sometimes, but like, it's not like 2009. It's not like 2013. It's not like 2017. How many gradations of 3 years can I talk about until we run out of LeBron James years here? But it is, like you said, blowing up actions, knowing what the opposing coach is calling, communicating with your teammates, being huge and strong, somebody that you just can't bully down in the post. So, like you said, he's like the ultimate skeleton key type of player, and he adds a little bit of value on defense, and he's a solid offensive player. And when you're positive on both ends in this conversation, it helps you out quite a bit.
I guess my thing is, it's hard to look at the regular season data from the last year or two and apply it to the playoffs. His health has been up and down. I think that's a huge part of it. But also the playoffs are just a different animal. They're a different animal on both ends of the court. And I wouldn't think of him as a positive defender throughout the course of the year. But man, I think there's some value there on the defensive end as well in the postseason. That's a great segue to who's next, Luka Doncic, who we talked about quite a bit. I guess my question, or I should say we talked about quite a bit over the summer. I guess my question is, has anything changed for you with Luka Doncic, or are we still just talking about the same on-ball monster Helio guy who, when he's off-ball, you're wondering where the value is, or to be clear, because sometimes people get confused, the same level of value. Like there's a massive drop-off between Luka Doncic on-ball and Luka Doncic off-ball, and we consistently see a signal over Luka's career extending to the Lakers where when he is in a position where you start to take away some of these other players, he can keep the team at a higher and higher level. Meaning if the team is a 50-win team from its offense with Jalen Brunson or with LeBron James or Austin Reeves or Kyrie Irving or Spencer Dinwiddie, whatever other good skill ball dominant player you want to put out there, and you just start stripping them away, the team goes like down to like a 48 win level or 47 win. He keeps them up there, which means his on-off looks great when those players aren't out there. And then the more players, the better players you add to the team, his on-off looks worse and worse. I think that's a consistent thing that we have seen. He got in better shape this year. And I guess a question would be, do you think his defense has changed in any material way as well?
Well, first of all, what I want to shout out offensively is I think the three kings right now of the kick ahead pass, I guess Halliburton probably be in there, but he didn't get to play this year. But I think he and LeBron and Jokic are just the three best players are kicking ahead to their teammates. And seeing LeBron and Luka being able to take advantage of that as teammates is one of the great joys in life. And I think Marcus Smart likes to get in on the action. He's like, hey, guys, I can also throw some nice kick ahead passes. But his precision, right, and his just no hesitation to be like, there's a sliver of space, I'm going to get it to you. That sort of thing, like that separates to me like the great passers from some of the all-time types of passers. And Luka is able to open up so much offense through those kinds of situations where it's like, I'm going to take this sliver. And LeBron, of course, does the same thing like we just talked about. I think compared to like Luka's peak, I liked the fact that Luka was more of a forward-facing downhill threat. Like he still does that to an incredible degree at this point, but it seems like he goes more to the back down a little bit more offensively, and I think that can slow down an offense. It can grind down the offense to a little bit more of a chugging halt. But like you said, that ultimately doesn't matter if you strip away a lot of the talent around him. But I almost wonder if he's less portable now, to use that term again, than he was a couple of seasons ago. And I think that's what I think about offensively. But at the end of the day, we're still talking about just an unbelievable offensive engine. Defensively, like you said, it's really interesting because I think on ball, he's big, he's strong, he's long, he can get in front of you and contest some shots, but I feel like he can get lost a little bit in a lot of moving actions. I think he loses value defensively where he complains to the refs and he doesn't get back in time, and teams are able to attack in 5-on-4 types of situations. Ultimately, I still think we're looking at a negative defensive player.
This is an interesting comment you made. So you don't think this is his peak? You think his peak was like 2024, something like that?
I think his peak was a couple of years ago.
Okay. And what do you think has changed since his peak? What do you think is slightly worse, I guess?
Well, I think to me, it seems like he's lost a little bit of his verve athletically. Like you said, he seemed to be in better shape than maybe last year, but I feel like he was quicker. I feel like he was quicker off the bounce a couple of years ago, and that added some dynamism to his pick and roll attack. Don't get me wrong, still all-time level pick and roll attacker, still incredible at reading the defense and whatever else. But like I said, it felt like a lot of those drives turned into, I'm going to get my back into the guy. And that just gives the defense a little bit more opportunity to rotate and get to where they want to be, as opposed to being like, I am facing the basket and going downhill. You have to make a snap decision right now as to how you're going to defend it. So I think we're talking minuscule levels here, but I thought he was better a couple seasons ago.
What about the defense? You think the defense was essentially the same, or was there any positive movement on that end in your mind? And maybe the way to phrase it is, do you see a better high end for his defense now, or is it kind of still the same?
Man, that's really tough because I know he was struggling with injuries, but that final series against the Celtics in 24, was like the nadir of his defensive abilities. I know he had like a bloody knee. He was dealing with some stuff. I don't know exactly. I don't think he's that bad of a defender. I don't know if there's a lot of evidence for me to move him too much. So I say he's probably pretty similar to what he was a couple of years ago.
Okay. And the tricky part for me defensively with him is always sort of the roster you build around him. And you get in these playoff series and you have a player that is a slower player. And I mean, literally slower, like foot speed, and just that's the nature of the game. What do you do with a player like that? You want that to be your center. You almost want Luka to be like the Jokic of his team defensively, and then you build around that. But if he's not that, then is he sort of the de facto power forward? And what happens when he finds a series where he can't hide? I think that was the big issue for me with the Celtics series, was the Celtics are designed, that 2024 Celtics team was designed to hunt out the weakness and put him in a position where you're like, good luck. I mean, okay, Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, Drew Holiday, it doesn't matter. You're not going to have a good time with this. And anytime he's in a playoff series in a situation like that, I think it has larger downstream effects than just a normal, like, you can get beat off the dribble sometimes. So
do you think that ultimately grades out to being a negative defender?
Yes, but
okay.
Yes, I think in a minute when we circle around on all the wagons, or maybe you can do it now. Like, if you look at Luka as a defensive piece in the playoffs, and you look at Jokic as a defensive piece in the playoffs, and you look at Karl-Anthony Towns as a defensive piece in the playoffs, are those all very similar to you? Do you have a hierarchy? Is there some clear, even if small, lines of demarcation?
I think this season I viewed them all similar, but if we go back to the last couple seasons and use some of that data at their peaks, I think Jokic is probably the best defender of the three.
Okay, got it. I think I still am most comfortable with Jokic in a playoff series. I would have Towns next, and I think Towns has, as I was getting at earlier, displayed a much better kind of positive, optimistic range of like, hey, look what we can do in this situation. And then Luka is a little bit behind them, as I think he's giving back a little bit more that I still haven't seen shored up. Whereas like with Jalen Brunson, I saw a little bit more evidence this year of like, okay, you can shore that up a little bit better as the small guard who's hunted.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I want to emphasize this again. I do think he loses value defensively with complaining shenanigans that he gets into, right? I think that happens way too often where he almost gifts the other team like those kinds of possessions. And that really adds up when you're able to fly ahead and transition. I think if it was the playoffs and they were deeper in the playoffs, that may have come up even more. So yeah, I think you're right in putting him third in that conversation.
Well, it's a great point because we haven't mentioned little things at all. And over the years, these little things, these special team spaces, not just transition, rebounding, loose balls, screens, communication, but also in the huddle, your ability to pick out something and tell a teammate what to do, what the leadership style is in practice. All these little things have kind of an impact on not just the personality of the team, but the nature of playing one of these teams in a playoff series and what it means to go up against their personality in a playoff series. There's always just a little of that moving these numbers one way or another. My point is, we talk about offense and we say offense is a bucket. And then we talk about defense and defense is a bucket. And we put them together. And when you do that, the trap is you look at passing and scoring and shooting, and you look at rim protection and point of attack defense, and you leave out all those other little things that do have some value, whatever bucket we want to put them in. We want to gift them to the offensive side. We want to gift them to the defensive side. They do move the needle a little bit when we're differentiating at this level. So
I was just going to say, and I don't know if we can put a numerical value to it, but I do wonder like how much of a change can a little thing guy have? Because if we are saying that there's actually a pretty substantial impact that these little things add up to, playoff LeBron, that's where he ends up getting his boost, right? Like this is the whole like 2019 Kyle Lowry thing. Like you can't necessarily point to the offense or defense, but there's all the other stuff that's happening. The fact that LeBron at 41 years old is like full-blown Dennis Rodman laying out to steal a loose ball at some point in the playoffs. Like those sorts of things, being able to read the defense and the offense is so well and communicate just on a dime like that. I don't know if you take the gulf between the lowest possible player and the highest possible player. I think we're actually talking about a solid margin that could swing like a ranking like this.
It can. Yeah. All right. The next player I have written down is Dylan Harper. Wait a second. No, it's not. That's 2028. Sorry. Those are my 2028 notes. I have two more small guards I want to quickly discuss. And then we have two heavyweights to round out the conversation today. I know you have some thoughts on the Tyrese Maxey, Donovan Mitchell kind of group. I think we can put them together. I have reservations about both of these players, and they're similar types of players. They can be really good shooters. I think Maxey's shooting is a question mark. Mitchell's is not. The passing isn't necessarily there. They're very spunky getting into the paint. One thing though is scheme. And with Maxey, we saw like the Knicks just double teamed him over and over again. Two guys on the ball in the pick and roll. He didn't know what to do. He had no idea what to do. So I think he does a lot better with a second player next to him. I think Mitchell's defense is a concern for me. I think Maxey's defense got a lot better this year, but I will pass you the baton, my friend, and let you wax poetic on these guys.
Yeah, I think the main difference between them offensively, Donovan Mitchell, I just trust a lot more as like you have the ball initiate the offense, right? Like the pull-up three is a lot more dangerous. Him getting into the paint from that position is a lot more dangerous. Things like that I think are a lot more successful than we see from Tyrese Maxey. We have a good amount of evidence from Maxey that he just plays better offensively when somebody like Embiid is on the court with him. And so that's almost a differentiator between them, is Maxey is a lot more of the secondary offensive player that we talked about when we were talking about the best offensive players earlier in the season here, where if you have a higher end offensive talent like a Jokic, an Embiid, somebody that can play that maybe DHO hub, Maxey's going to get a lot more burn out of that, right? Because it's taking away a lot of the burden of having to break down a defense yourself. He can just use his blinding speed, find an opening there, and then make the read, right? So he adds a lot of value there, but ultimately I saw Mitchell as being a better offensive player because of his ability to just kind of do it on his own there. I'm extremely impressed with Maxey's defense. He tries so hard on that end. He has such a high motor. He is not worried about getting into it. He's got feisty little hands. He can make some plays at the rim once in a while. Honestly, for his size, I gave him a little bit of a positive boost here. Like, I think he's like legitimately, I'm not saying he's up to some of these other guys, but I think he's at least a little bit positive on the defensive end just from what he's able to do with his athleticism and motor. And I think that's a huge differentiator between him and Mitchell, who I view as a negative defender overall.
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of difference where even if Mitchell is a slightly better offensive player, I think that difference means at the end of the day, you're probably better off with Maxey in more situations because it is about avoiding weaknesses. It is about avoiding targets and gaps. And especially defensively, you can synergize so much because there's no ball when you just have strength on top of strength on top of strength. When you have a weakness you have to plug up, then it's like the Nuggets that we talked about earlier, kind of constructing the entire roster around protecting Nikola Jokic's defensive weaknesses, trying to amplify his defensive strengths, and try to do that while also cashing in on some of his offensive benefits on the other end of the court. So, all right, we have two heavy hitters left to wrap up this conversation. Do you have another player you'd like to discuss?
Well, I was actually, I could do this all day. This is Captain America over here.
Are you just warming up? Is this the first half of the show for you?
I was going to say, are we getting down to, well, you said Dylan Harper. I had some notes down here. I was wondering if we were going to get into him. But in terms of like these offensive, small guards, good scoring punch and things like that, how do you feel about Jamal Murray compared to those other two guys?
Yeah, I don't think he's too far behind. I do think I prefer Mitchell and Maxey. I like what you said about Maxey's defense. I don't really know how I feel about it. I have a wide range for his defensive evaluation, and I do have his defensive evaluation on the high end as being a slight positive. So I think he could be a negative, but I think he could be a slight positive. And I can't really say that about most of these other guards that we've talked about. I certainly wouldn't say that about Donovan Mitchell. I wouldn't say it about Brunson. I wouldn't say it about Luka. I think those guys are all probably negatives, but when I get the rosier glasses out for Maxey, I do think he's a positive. Jamal Murray, his size is a difference. He's like 6'3.5" or whatever. Barefoot, he's a little bit more stout, but he's had some inconsistencies defensively this year that bothered me a little bit. And so it's like the same thing. We're right back with the same thing. I'm like, I want you to be solid defensively and not potentially leaky defensively. He's a great shooter, but also the injuries and he had a great regular season this year, but I am not ready to just say like, oh yeah, he's up there. We should have him as a candidate here. He's up there. He's similar, but I feel like he's slightly behind some of these other players.
Okay, I'll accept that. I just wanted to throw him out there. I won't. Let's get to the big ones. Let's get to these big guns at the end.
Well, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is second to last here. And we did a very, very long deep dive on him last summer. And I would say, I just feel like we're continuing to see the same signals that concern me. It's that DeMar DeRozan spectrum where it's like, okay, you're going to amplify 3-point shooters around you. He's going to do his thing. I think he did improve this year a little bit as a playmaker and a passer. Double teaming and things of this nature were a question in terms of how he was attacked defensively in this postseason. But I do think we're talking about a player who's similar to where he was last year, if not slightly better on the offensive end.
Yeah. And I feel like the playoff numbers that you see start getting a little bit dicier. Whereas you look at some of the regular season data, his offense, this is the conversation we have. He looks like Michael Jordan in the regular season. And some of that just comes back to earth a little bit more. So obviously unbelievable scorer. I think he was more efficient in these playoffs, right? But like you said, he's not opening up a lot of rim attempts for his teammates. Yep. And that's a lot of that is his play style, but it's also his play style by design for how the Thunder play offense. So it'd be interesting to see him in other styles, but he himself can get to the paint and he gets to the free throw line. So he gets a lot of efficient scoring that way. So we're still talking about just like a massive, massive offensive player in terms of his footprint. I don't think he's not to the level of somebody like Jokic, right? But he's at least in the mix when we talk about some of the other high-end guys there. Defensively, I see him as a very solid positive. I think somebody like Cade Cunningham, if we're going to talk about guards, is a better defender than Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. I have him weighted out here. But I don't even think Shai is just like a minor positive. Like he's a little bit higher than that. So he gets some value on that end. And I think that boosts him quite a bit with the offense he brings.
Yeah. The scoring numbers that you're alluding to, regular season this year, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, 34 points plus 9% true shooting. That's literally Michael Jordan type numbers.
Yeah.
And then we go to the playoffs, 29 points plus 2% shooting. Mm-hmm. And that's, I don't want to say pedestrian, but that comes way back down to orbit, right? So pretty massive shift there. And then the things we were tracking last summer that I was really interested in looking at this season as well, as we get a larger sample, was, okay, Shai has that impact footprint where you get into the playoffs. Mm-hmm. He's going to set up his teammates for a ton of open threes. And as we just talked about, especially some of those corner threes, but open threes are shot at a lower percentage in the postseason across the board. The corner three drops more than above the break. At least when you're slightly contested, I should say. So what does that mean to that playmaking style? If you're just saying like, let him touch the paint and spray, we're going to throw a ton of extra bodies at you. We're going to throw a wall at you. We had a whole conversation about this, and we continue to see the exact same thing in this year's playoffs. And the result of that is like, any way you slice the multiple year data for the Thunder, their offense does not look that good when Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is on the court. And last year we talked a lot about shooting luck. Does that continue? But now I'm just starting to think the larger the sample gets, the more it's the style of play, and the defenses are smart enough to be like, yeah, we're pretty comfortable helping off Lou Dort and then closing out on him and making him shoot that shot against our playoff closeout, our playoff level closeout. So what does that mean for Shai's overall value? I still think he's a great offensive player. I think we still have to account for, as you said, the team around him, the fact that it is kind of just him doing everything, and he's quite good in that role. And it's reasonable to think that if he had a Scottie Pippen or another kind of secondary or tertiary player in a slightly different system, that he can continue to be very effective. And this year we did not see that at the end of the series they lost. I think they would have won that series and probably the second NBA championship in a row if they had Jalen Williams and AJ Mitchell. But when you run out of those players, Shai could not necessarily handle the totality of Victor Wembanyama's defense, and we'll get to that in a second.
And obviously, a lot of that weight fell on Chet Holmgren, who, as we talked about a little bit when they were knocked out, just doesn't have the offensive gear to be that secondary creator, right? And so he just, like you just said, he just didn't have anyone to be able to hold that for him. Can I ask a direct comparison? Is that legal? Is that going to make people mad?
No, please. We're now into the third hour. You can do whatever you want.
Shea's offense versus Brunson's offense. Which way are you leaning between these two?
I feel pretty comfortable for Shea's offense.
Okay.
Yeah. I would say, I mean, there's a reason why Shea was deep in the conversation in our top 25 greatest peaks of the 21st century last summer, and Brunson was a name we mentioned in the honorable mentions to start the series. And I think it's because you do go up to that next level with Shea. We're just splitting hairs about, is he at the middle of that level, the bottom of that level, the top of that level, versus, I think Brunson would need another gear or another weapon in his toolkit to get to that level. So I feel comfortable going Shea. Do you see it differently?
Nope. I had him a solid margin over Brunson too.
Okay. You were just setting me up for disaster with that.
I was just interested. I like to kind of figure out exactly what we're talking about numerically. Because again, the regular season, like Shea's, when he's on the court, they're like 8 points better than league average. There's like a 10-point swing when he's on versus off. It's just those numbers shift in the playoffs, but we still see that enormous swing in the regular season. And a lot of those skills do work in the playoffs. They won the championship. They could have won the championship once again this season. So I'm with you on that one.
Well, I think it's an interesting segue to our last player, because our last player to discuss for me is very comfortably the worst offensive player we're going to discuss.
Yes, I have him graded out as the lowest of everyone we talked about. Yeah.
Yes. So I think it's very interesting. He's the last player we're going to discuss, Victor Wembanyama. He has a very unique offensive style, but I think the thing to really understand is that he is not a player you just throw out there without anyone else, just, hey, give me some role players, give me some 3-and-D shooters, we're good to go, and you have a really good offense. I don't think that's the type of offensive player he is right now. I think you're closer to something like the Anthony Davis model of offense that we saw in the 2020 championship Lakers team, where you are sort of a secondary player who can disrupt the defense, who can cause problems, who has skills that can move into these primary takeover zones. I mean, game one of the Western Conference Finals, what did he have, 41 points in that game, and all kinds of tough shots in overtime and isolation and second overtime at the end of regulation. I mean, that's a thing. That's a dynamic or dimension that he still has right now. But in terms of what we've talked about on the offensive side of the ball, he's only really applying this massive pressure on the defense as a role threat or as having this rim gravity. Still not sure how I feel about the value of that rim gravity versus like perimeter gravity, because as we talked about last summer, perimeter gravity, like Steph Curry's, opens up the paint, which is the highest real estate area for your teammates. The roll gravity does cause issues, but it opens up the 3-point line, which is an easier thing to access from different parts of the court. So I don't know if it's quite as valuable. It does help. It does help the rim a little bit. I shouldn't say Victor Wembanyama's roll gravity doesn't help the rim. It does help his guards getting downhill. We've seen over and over again, guys don't want to leave to help on the guard, so the guard can get an easier shot at the basket. And that does come out in the data. When you look at his data footprint, Wemby is like making teammates' lives easier at the basket just with this factor. So he's a very interesting offensive player. That's hard to kind of draw a perimeter around and figure out how valuable that is. And then Cody, I mean, the man is a completely singular, unique defensive engine unto himself, like we maybe haven't seen since Bill Russell. We've talked about this before. The range of what, like in my notes, I'm like, I mean, he could be merely competing with the best defenders of the 21st century, the Kevin Garnett's and the Ben Wallace's of the world, and whoever else you want to put in there, Tim Duncan and Draymond Green, or he could just be out on his own island when it comes to defensive impact. Because of all the numbers that we've talked about, we've seen the singular way he twists up teams at the basket and in the paint. And if anything, that effect seems to be amplified in a playoff series. And if you're thinking like, wait, didn't they just get smoked by the Knicks? No, the Knicks did the best job against them, and the Knicks still only had whatever it was, a 109 offensive rating. So yeah, there's a lot to try to figure out with just how good 22-year-old Victor Wembanyama is.
I really like your point about how valuable roll gravity might be, because I think that was philosophically the point that I was really struggling with Wemby, is when I think about offensive players, there's like different levels to what I'm imagining from that sort of offensive player. And I always think the best offensive players require a significant amount of defensive game planning. And you can see that the way that teams scheme against him, there's a significant amount of defensive game planning. Like every team that goes against the Spurs is just like, we cannot let this guy catch the ball anywhere in around the paint. And everything is organized around that question. And then whatever happens outside in the offense is almost a secondary concern. It's like, we'll get to those other things. No matter what, this guy can't catch it. And obviously that's incredibly value. That sort of latent value has a certain floor for how good you're going to be offensively. But like you said, that's an excellent point where it's like, it opens up all these 3-point shooters. But when you look at the Spurs, they're not filled with a bunch of guys that are necessarily going to punish that way. So you're actually not able to actualize the value that Wembanyama brings to the table. We're not talking about like the championship runs of Akeem Olajuwon, where it's like, all right, we got you down there, everyone else is space, we throw it down to you, double comes, swing, 3-point shot, right? Like it doesn't look like that sort of thing with the Spurs. So that's an awesome point that I'm going to take away from this one, because I do still think that it's a pretty solid floor that he has of how much game planning that they have to bring. And so that's where I wanted to start with that. Defensively,
let me jump in on that. Let me jump in on that, because what's interesting is this effect is there in the regular season. We can all see it, but it went through the roof in the playoffs with teams trying to game plan around this and be like, nah, we can't give up all these easy dunks and layups. We can't have him have really juice scoring, shooting 78% at the basket on these catches. And so the result of that was the Spurs ended up shooting in the regular season about 47% of their shots were threes when Wemby was on the court. That goes over up to 50% in the playoffs. And the rim scoring that they have when he's on the court in the regular season, or I should say in the playoffs, it goes down about 4 points from the regular season. So we do actually see a shift in the way defenses were able to play them and just say, hey, we're going to clog up the paint and force you to make more threes. And the Spurs, just to be clear, the Spurs offense, when Victor Wembanyama was on the court in the regular season, was very good. It was +7. It was 7 points better than league average. And in the playoffs, it was still very good. It was +6. I think one of the things that warps your brain is that they hardly lost his minutes. We track this stat throughout the entire second half of the year. They hardly lost his minutes, but they just lost a series where they lost 4 really close games, or 3 super close games, and 1 game that turned into a 9-point game in the last 2 minutes. So they were really successful on offense in the playoffs with Wemby, even if it looked a little different, and he was still the driving force. And I think that's what makes it so darn hard to just figure out how valuable that is, especially without great 3-point shooting teammates.
So you can't look at that and even be like, oh, he's like a neutral offensive player. That's not even close to a reality.
It's not even close. It's not even. That's what I'm saying. Like, think about Anthony Davis at his best, and then, I mean, Anthony Davis's individual shot making, I think, was better back in the bubble. I mean, obviously, Anthony Davis bubble couldn't miss, right? But you got to take what Anthony Davis is as an archetype offensively and almost crank it up with Victor Wembanyama to start thinking about an approximation, a comparable player for playoff style impact just on the offensive side.
Yeah, that's exactly where I grade out with that as well. But that becomes really dicey, because if we're also talking about whatever high end we're talking about with his defense, I mean, all of a sudden we're talking about just like the greatest
what's
player
so
of all time.
I don't understand what's dicey about this. I don't understand what's dicey about this. let's put the defense into perspective. I mentioned expected plus minus EPM from dunks and threes is just a single 1-number metric that we have in the public domain. And what I think is really instructive about this is to look at his defensive EPM, which they estimate to be around +4 points. He's worth 4 points of value per 100 possessions on defense, and say, where would that rank among the offensive players we just discussed? We discussed the best offensive players in the league. So if you take that ranks right next to Jalen Brunson's offense
Mm-hmm.
And we know Jalen Brunson gets almost all of his value from offense. Just his defense alone is like the value of an offensive top 10 player, according to that stat. Now, whether it's a little less or a little bit more, I don't know. That's what we're trying to figure out. But I think it's instructive to just look at that. And while we're here, we've always talked about throughout the course of the year his impact defending the paint. Teams scored in the playoffs about 60 points against the Spurs in the rim area, in the short mid-range area, and including free throws when Victor Wembanyama was on the court. The gold standard in the entire history we have this data going back to the late 90s is Cody's Milwaukee Bucks that we started with, Giannis Antetokounmpo and Brook Lopez on the court together, twin towering and giving up threes in exchange for protecting this paint. And they were like 56, 57 in their best playoff stretches. So just with Wemby, you just throw him out there and you are almost at the equivalent rim protection place of Giannis and Brook Lopez biasing the paint, which is basically the best we've seen in 30 years. It really is a startling amount. And we saw it from series to series, how it just influences almost every possession that he's on the court tactically in terms of what the other team's trying to do.
So you made a comment before. It's like compared to other 21st century defensive players, like you sent out a stat. You talked about a stat last podcast we talked about where I think it was like, do you remember Ben Wallace's numbers when he was on the court in the playoffs to the Pistons? And Wemby's is right in the same ballpark, right? And these are some of the best numbers that we've seen this century. So you're talking about Ben Wallace, you talk about Kevin Garnett, whomever else you see as the best defensive players, and you're like,
Karl-Anthony Towns.
Karl-Anthony Towns, obviously. It's like, does he grade out merely as well as these guys? Is he a little below? Is he a little above? To me, there's no hesitation. This is the most impact we've seen from a defensive player this century. Do you agree with that, at least as a starting point?
I do.
Okay.
I do. I think again, if I look at the ranges I still have a very wide range because this is an emerging phenomenon that I'm trying to get my head around. Mm-hmm. And so if I look at the ranges, there are a couple players whose range or valuation, like I say, okay, Kevin Garnett, your peak defense, is it better than the low range for Wemby? Yeah, I can see the argument. Draymond Green, I can see the argument. Probably Ben Wallace, probably Tim Duncan, maybe. I don't know. You start to run out of players real fast.
Yes.
Right? But then just a down the road median like, what do I think I actually just saw? Yeah, I think that's the best defense I've seen since Hakeem Olajuwon, probably in the 90s, and Dikembe Mutombo in the 90s. And then the high end for what we might be seeing with Wemby, I think is probably my highest high-end defensive evaluation of a player since maybe like Bill Walton in the 70s. I mean, you have to go way back to the Russell Walton. You got to go way back. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, that's kind of where I landed too. But when I was trying to put this together and I started going that medium high end, like there's not a lot of room for this offense before we start thinking this is literally just one of the best seasons that we've seen. And I don't know if I felt uncomfortable about that. I'm like, I need to see a little bit more. But at the end of the day, we're talking about just, unbelievable defensive footprint. We've talked about that so much at this point that I don't even know how to talk about his defense in interesting ways at this point.
All right. Do you want to try to sort of talk about, I think Tyrese Maxey and Donovan Mitchell are on the outside looking in this conversation. I think their high ranges could all get there. I mean, I think that's why we talked about them. I think Jaylen Brown's high range could all get there. And frankly, I think when you get to, for me, someone like Anthony Edwards, if I look at him from a higher range perspective, I think you can get all the way up to like 7th, something like that. Do you have different players or different kind of tiers as you start to go through and organize this?
Nope. You hit on sort of the honorable mentions that I was looking at on my list.
Yeah, I think those are the honorable mentions for me. Now we have to say when you start to add in the health thing and you start to say like, could the old guys, could LeBron and Steph make it through a postseason series? I don't know. It becomes more complicated. This is where I think it's so interesting to say, if the franchise needs you to do a lot of heavy lifting, I might want one of these other guys. But if you can be in a situation where the franchise needs you to be a second or tertiary weapon, and then you come to life in the right moments and you can play more limited minutes, then I want one of the older guys, right? Health pending. If they're healthy. I mean, literally Steph Curry doesn't play at the end of the year. There's nothing Luka Doncic didn't play at the end of the year, that kind of stuff.
I know. And I think that's going to make some people really uncomfortable as we're talking about players that miss substantial time. And you're like, can this person even make it very far in the playoffs? And I don't know. In the current NBA, the way that it's played, the way that injuries happen, the spacing out of games between the playoffs, I'm just not sure of the best way to do it. So I'm thinking of like peak player, I guess in the secondary role sort of thing, like you're saying. It's I don't know. It's complicated, Ben.
I think the hardest one for me here is Towns, because I think we have a little bit of a disagreement. I think his defense, I still don't know what to make of it, but I'm feeling like if you are more optimistic about his defense, if you give his defense a little bit more credit, he's such a good offensive player. Where does that leave him? I kind of feel like that leaves him ahead of the Maxey, Mitchell, Edwards. Did I mention Jaylen Brown? I think Jaylen Brown's probably in that group. But I don't know. Do you have thoughts on Karl Towns?
Yeah, so even if I'm just plugging in even my high end here to see where he ends up, if I give him the high end offense, I still think the defense just takes him right outside of the top 10, right? Like I think I would have to be higher on the defense for me to think he has a legitimate shot at being a candidate for the top 10. And I think I personally need more evidence to be convinced that is a real thing that we see from him.
I feel like after this conversation, I've got 8 players that I like in kind of a top 8-ish. And then I got 6 big time players that I also represent another leveling up. And so what that means is I can make an argument, I can make a high-end argument for some of these players in the top 10 or potentially even at number 8 or number 7, right? Some of these players like Karl-Anthony Towns, I think if we're being generous, I do think there's room that you got to see what happens with this defense, man. I mean, my mind is just all over the place. But the point is, if you have these optimistic valuations based on everything we talked about, I do think that that's the level of player we're talking about, kind of a back of the top 10 level player. Did we mention LeBron James and Steph Curry?
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you said LeBron. I think you said Curry, but maybe you would just include LeBron.
No, I would. Yes, I have LeBron and Curry kind of in this range as well at the back of the top 10. Do you feel I have 8 players after that I want to get to that I haven't mentioned?
I think I have Curry a little higher in my median range.
Tell me more.
I'm really in love with his offense. Maybe I'm not as low on his defense as I should be. Like he might be a little bit more porous than I'm saying. And it's just that didn't stand out to me quite as much. And I'm still pretty convinced by the gravity, by his shooting prowess, by all the other metrics that we're seeing with him, that I'm like, we're still talking like a solidly top 10 player, even closer to like 6, 7, 8 range.
See, I think that's fair.
Okay.
Jalen Brunson and Cade Cunningham, I think to me kind of represent a soft 7, 8-ish border at the top of this group. I don't know if my high end of either Jalen Brunson or Cade Cunningham can get into my top 6.
Mm-hmm.
I just think there's a big jump for me to the top 6 players this year. But also, if I have to choose based on the things we just talked about, those are probably the guys I have at the top of this group. And then I would add Curry and LeBron with the age/health issue to sort out. I think that's kind of how I see the ranges of these players breaking down.
Yeah, I think that sounds about right.
Okay. And then that top 6 group is Luka, Kawhi, Giannis, Shea, Jokic, Wemby, those 6 players. In terms of, again, we talked about this, like Luka and Kawhi are pretty close to me. I don't know if that is shocking to some people, but I also don't think their high-end range probably gets you in the top 3. Those 3 those 3 MVP finalists, I do think are all monsters, and there's a reason why literally the rest of the players at this point we talked about last summer and having the best peaks of the 21st century. And then, of course, a new addition to that would be Victor Wembanyama, who, if we did the series again, would have to be in the series. So outside of those three finalists for MVP, I think Luka and Kawhi are kind of next and very close. But I don't think their high end gets you in that final top three candidacy.
So you say you have the top three, Wemby, Jokic, Shea, and then after that, probably like Luka, Kawhi?
No, Giannis Antetokounmpo exists.
Okay, good. Well. That's what I was going to say. I had Giannis sort of maybe in the back end, if not within that group of the three MVP finishers.
Well, Giannis is almost in the middle. I would say he's closer to the top three, but Giannis is different in that I think Giannis is high end. For me, you can argue that he's the best player in basketball. And that's the thing we were talking about with if his defense still has the punch, then I think you can make the argument that Giannis, when he's healthy and when he's going, we just saw him have his best defensive season. If his defense is still there, I think you can make the argument he's the best player in basketball. What's the low end of that range look like? I don't really think you could probably drop Giannis much below 6 in that group, that big 6 that we were talking about. So for me, certain things very hard to position, very hard to kind of corral, but I do think there's this differentiation right now between, the top 3, the top 6, and then that group behind them. And, you mentioned a couple other players. We could have talked about Jamal Murray more today, right? He could kind of be in the extension of that back group of players that we talked about. I know you love Evan Mobley, Scotty Barnes, Devin Booker is another player who's lingered in there. Pascal Siakam's great. Then you start to get into the OG Anunobys of the world. So, but at a certain point, when you have a really robust upper middle class of superstars, you got to draw the line somewhere else. You're having 2.5-hour podcast.
I was going to say Siakam's actually the guy that I think might be a little bit higher closer to that honorable mention group than we would have seen. And I think maybe, I don't know how much we talked about him last year, but I still think he looked pretty spectacular for a pretty struggling Pacers team. But we saw his high-end defense, at least in the finals and playoffs, going to be quite destructive. Offensively, it does a bunch of little stuff, but that's way far away from the top 10. He's in that honorable mention group.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting for me, Cody, is if I look at the way I try to evaluate players, and I look at these 3 MVP finalists, the low range of all the players for me is pretty similar. Meaning, if I'm pessimistic on how I think about them, I think they're interchangeable. You go 1, 2, 3. I don't know. Doesn't matter to me. It looks all the same. But what's interesting is when you start to look at the potential high end and the potential, like, what actually is the impact of having a massive defensive force who also influences the game on offense. I think Victor Wembanyama already at 22 has a staggeringly high-end valuation. Like, if we were to go back and do the 21st century peaks last year, kind of, why are you giggling? What's happening? Why are you laughing?
Just love that you're doing this. This is where my mind was going.
Well, no, I mean, I think if you go back and you look at this last year for a high end, I mean, we might have only had a couple players in that range, and Victor Wembanyama is already there. And it's mostly just because it's just what it does when you have a two-way impact. I've talked about this for so many years. Defense naturally allows you to change your lineup flexibility because there isn't a ball that you have to share. You don't have to worry about synergies as much. You don't have to worry about redundancies. And then he also has the offensive impact. And I do think there are weaknesses in things that we've seen: isolation game, strength, post up, some decision making, even some of the passing. I think is going to get better in the future, or certainly has a place to get better. But we've never seen a defensive impact like this in the last 30 years, at least in this century. And I think that does give him a crazy high end, high range. And so I'd probably, if I had to sort them, I'd probably lean Wemby, Jokic, Shea in that order, but I'm not sure I have a huge preference among that top 3. It's more like those 3 players plus Giannis have the case for my number 1 spot. And then I think Giannis and Kawhi and Luka round out a pretty significant or substantial top 6 level of player, and then there's a drop off to all the other things we discussed.
Yeah, that's almost exactly in line with what I got over here.
That's it. To support the show, patreon.com/thinking basketball. I never thought I'd see the day we petered Cody out with a brisk walk through the top players in the NBA. Do you have final thoughts before we wrap?
This was really fun. Honestly, it's been 2 hours and 20 minutes. Am I petered out? Yes, but that flew by. That actually did not feel like 2.5 hours. That was a quick one in my mind.
Cool. Well, thanks for listening all the way on this one. Hope you enjoyed it as always, and that you are having a great day.